So good morning and welcome to day 9 of the hearing for the Victorian Murray Floodplain Restoration Project relating to Environmental Effects Statement Package, Central Package. The hearing is being audio recorded, as parties will be aware. My name is Lisa Kendall and I'm Chair of the Committee considering the EES Central Package. And I'm joined by my colleagues, Member Kirsch as Deputy Chair, Member Bell, Member Carruthers and Member Ham. Just advising all parties, Member Ham will need to leave the hearing at around 12 noon today, so he will be here for the majority of today's sitting. Just a couple of preliminary matters to run through. So as according to our timetable, we'll be hearing submissions from a number of parties today. Just like to advise that Donald McLeod has advised that he no longer wishes to appear. So that will assist with easily accommodating the additional time requested by Professor Piddock of another 5 or 10 minutes. And this afternoon, the Murdocks have asked for an additional 5 minutes, which can be accommodated. I'll just run through the documents received. The hearing submission from the Murdocks the hearing presentation submission is document 161. The Victorian National Parks Association hearing submission is 162. Professor Piddock has provided some additional supplementary material for their submission relating to the proponent's economic consultancy report, and that's document 163. And I note that the proponent has uploaded technical notes 11 and 12. We'll give those document numbers 164 and 165. I'll just check that that's what's been expected in terms of documents received.
Yes, that's correct. I was going to give you an update more broadly of what to expect after today as well, but I can do that when you call for preliminary matters.
Thank you. So just a couple of other preliminary matters to run through, and then I'll come to you, Mr. Townsend, to take us through that. Firstly, the committee was just asking if the proponent could please confirm that our request from earlier in the week to acknowledge and extend an invitation to the traditional owner groups who provided emails via the CMA. So the documents 151 to 154 have been, that correspondence has been, or that advice has been issued to those groups in acknowledgement of those, that material being provided to the committee. So I'll get you to respond to that, Mr. Townsend, when I come to you next. And the final preliminary matter for the committee is just, again, thanking the proponent very much for document 143, which includes a list of the committee requests and questions on notice. We have reviewed those and we had just a very discrete number of clarifications and a couple of questions that we're intending to issue in writing today. But I note that with the technical notes that have just come in, we'll make sure that we cross-check against those so that we don't ask you anything or clarify anything unnecessarily. So it may not be this morning that document comes out, but it'll be as soon as we can get it to you. So that was it in terms of preliminary matters from the committee. So Mr. Townsend, I'll come to you for the things that we need to cover off this morning.
Thank you, Member Kendall. The first, I've got two broad matters. One is, as I've just suggested, the update on documents. The second, I think, will go some way to answering your question about the invitation to the traditional owners, and is a specific matter we seek to raise this morning about how we might best assist the committee. Given to us, it appears that there might be, from the committee's perspective, a vacuum where in fact there's actually a safe space. And I need to address you about how we might help the committee best understand the consultation that's in fact taking place, given that you're hearing from unauthorised persons in answers to the committee and not the traditional owners. But if I can deal with that second, on that, so we're very grateful Member Ham's here this morning because it's particularly important to what we're going to suggest. But if I can start with the housekeeping matters first, the first thing I can indicate is that the committee had asked for a walkthrough potentially on Wednesday with the footage, the drone footage of the floods. We think we've done better than that, and what's been is currently being worked up is a narration, which I think it appears in text on the footage, and that will be able to be emailed to the committee with a view to you then being able to play it in your own time and pause and use it. So if that's completed today, which we think it will be, you can expect that to be emailed to you on Monday. And hopefully that will save us having to do with it on Wednesday. It'll just be a tool that you'll have.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend. That sounds excellent. The committee greatly appreciates that.
Thank you. The second is we have been able to arrange now to have a link provided to the ecology GIS information, which I think Ms. Bell in particular will find useful. That will come with an explanatory email that will explain some limitations around it, but I'm content for that to happen on email. That will either be today or Monday. The documents you've just mentioned, the two technical notes, in addition, as I understand it, and I hope I'm not at cross purposes with you here, I don't think I am, there are some responses from Mr. Treadwell and Mr. Marsden. Actually, they might be the two you've received. I'll just look, Mr. Forrester's nodding at that. Okay, so can I indicate this? It seems to us that you have still got coming from us a technical note on the Living Murray and and then the responses to the questions of Ms. Jalley, Mr. Holmes and Mr. George. Now, in combination with what you've just raised about clarification questions that might come to other matters we've said we'd respond to, I think the convenient thing for us to do is to indicate to you that what we'll do is wait for those clarifications, and you can expect that when we file our Part C submissions on Tuesday, we will incorporate those other responses, as we said we would, and we will then attach those further responses from those experts in case there's any more matters we need to deal with on your questions. So I'm going to suggest we do that as the Part C bundle on Tuesday, which will be our main Part C submission, and including in that package outstanding responses to questions. That leaves the component of the Part C submission that we've extracted, which is our submissions to you on how the committee should approach native vegetation policies and the analogy with the conservation works exemption. And you've already asked us to file that on Monday, and that will be filed on Monday.
Yeah.
So that's the update. Hopefully by Tuesday hopefully you have everything that we have indicated we would provide. And we'll ensure that with the filing of that information on Monday, we'll also attach an email in the usual way to let you know what's still coming on the following day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Townsend. Could I please just clarify, and I haven't had a chance to review the two technical notes that have just come in any detail. So you just mentioned the evidence, the response to questions taken on notice from experts, Jalley, Holmes and George. So they are still to come, is that correct?
That's correct.
And what was your indicative timeline for that?
Well, I thought the best thing, you're going to give us we'll wait for those further questions.
Okay, that's great. Yeah.
And so what we had said in our briefing is there are some matters that we thought the expert should reply, and they're done as a technical note. There are still a number of questions we can just conveniently give answers for you in our Part C submission. We're assuming that at the moment that we'll wait for your questions in case there's anything for any of those experts that should be a direct answer, in which case we'll do it as a separate discrete technical note response. Or any further questions we might also put into the balance of questions we're answering for you, and you'll see those in our Part C submission. One way or another we're going to cover the field, yeah. But we think if your question looks like it needs a direct response from the expert, we're making sure to get it from the expert, not in submission. That's the balance we're trying to strike as we read the questions.
Thank you. That's clear and will work well. Thank you.
Thank you. May I move on to the matter of traditional owner consultation?
Yes.
I might ask the committee for a minute if they can reflect in their mind back to our opening submissions or the Part B in the morning when I addressed the committee on this matter, and in really to make 2 points. One was that on reflection and in the circumstances that will become clearer to you, the proponent had formed the view that the best way to assist the committee was in submission that we would be making after hearing from any feedback from any of the invitations. And that remains the case. And you will see that Part C, the submission, provides an explanation around the consultation process that hitherto is not clear to the committee and you don't have visibility of. But the second part of that is that then we've seen this week no submitters authorised to give answers to the committee so far, yet there have been quite strong statements made throughout the week from persons who have no insight, nor would they. And we're conscious of trying to assist the committee as best we can with your term of reference 38D, while on the other hand, respecting the safe space that's been created and the confidentiality and the direct relationships that are in place, both between VMFRP, that's just the Cultural Heritage Management Plan's work, but the direct consultation that is ongoing with the CMA and owners. And we're confident you'll see that far from a vacuum, there's a protected space. And you'll remember on the first day, I indicated to the committee that it will be very important in discharging your obligations under 38D to make the very careful distinction that having known views for the project is different from publicly known views or the committee having to know the views of. And so we've had to wrestle with how best to assist you in that regard. We were confident that we'd be able to do that in submission by giving you an overview and insight at a more general level to the machinations of what consultation looks like, which in my experience is far from superficial and certainly not the minimum. In fact, I've rarely seen anything like it. But we are also conscious that the committee might want some more visibility about that we need to provide you without offending any confidences. And to that end, what we've wondered is if it would assist the committee in discharging that obligation, if the committee turns its mind to its powers under the terms of reference and term of reference 42, under which the committee may receive or direct submissions as being confidential in nature and having a forum closed to the public for the purposes of receiving the submission. If so, what we would suggest is that as a discrete exercise and subject to Member Ham's availability in particular, possibly perhaps as the first part of the Wednesday, but even better perhaps as a discrete exercise on Tuesday, if you were to convene an hour, we would be able to share with the committee information without doing violence to any of our trust or obligations and relationships that will give you sufficient visibility to understand why it is that the consultation process does not necessarily extend to public sharing or sharing in this process. And I think it's a very important point in this case, and it's probably going to be the most important, a very important aspect for the committee and for other committees, I might say, in this space, that consultation doesn't equal submissions to public forums like this and must always respect, in fact, the opposite decision to not be involved in the public forum. So what looks like a vacuum is not, but our challenge is to share that or give you more visibility without disrupting the relationships or the very the way that consultation is in fact being carried out, which doesn't lend to an expert witness or a recitation in a written document. If that's something which in my submission the committee should agree is appropriate, it seems to me to fall squarely within the reason why the term of reference exists. And in the circumstances, in practical terms, the neat thing about doing it on Tuesday is we can have a separate link for it. And we would have, so you're aware, we would expect that for the committee, you may want the DPT representative to be invited, and that's perfectly appropriate. we would otherwise say it should be closed to the public. We would have the members of the CMA who are in fact in touch with the whole consultation process available. You will understand the considerable amount of data that exists. You'll be able to ask some questions, but we would prefer not to put any of it in writing to the committee. And if at the end of that, the committee felt that you needed something else or you needed to share something more publicly, that would be a matter for the committee and you could raise it with us. But at the very first instance, we're confident that that's the most sensitive way for us to solve the riddle that probably appears to the committee around responses to your invitations, as opposed to the nature of consultation that's in fact occurring. So if it was all right with you, my request would be that in the first instance, the committee give consideration to this. I'm not asking for that now, and let us know whether you could have a discrete session for say 1 hour on Tuesday at any time that suited the committee. Alternatively, that we make arrangements to somehow have a session on the Wednesday. It seems neater for us to be separated if possible. Is that a sufficiently clear?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Townsend, for the suggestion. I will just come to Member Ham to see if he does have any questions.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Townsend. Just to be clear, I think what the evidence or what's been presented to the committee to date has been what we're seeking is clarity around consultation to the extent that it's happened, and to, I guess, to the level of satisfaction that a reasonable person looking at what we conclude or what you're presenting would demonstrate that there has been consultation that is not only adequate, because adequate can be defined as meeting a basic regulatory requirement, but to a level of satisfaction that gives comfort that traditional owners feel that their considerations have been taken into account and they genuinely feel part of the whole process. That is the challenge for you, I guess, in presenting to us. We'll come back to you with availability, but you're in luck. I'm pretty free most of Tuesday, so we can build around that.
Thank you, Member Ham. Mr. Townsend, can I just please clarify whether the intent would be to invite any of the traditional owner representatives who have been engaged through the project as well, or are you suggesting it would be representatives of the proponent organisations?
Yes, I'd like not to say too much, but my intention for this session is that it would be the, or Mr. Kellerman, who you've met, who's from the Mallee CMA, with Mr. Murphy, who's the actual officer in charge of consultation, has been there for many years. We may have, I mean, the preparation of CHMPs, there's obviously an overlap, but there's a separate process for that, and we could have someone from the VMFRP, but that's not as confidential because they're public steps and we're able to just set those out for you in submission. But that would have been the intention, not to require anybody to address you themselves. Where that leads to on Tuesday, we would leave for later if that would be our preference, but certainly my intention is to give you an explanation. Look, there's plenty we can show you, but there's a high level of discretion and sensitivity.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend. And to clarify, you're suggesting approximately an hour for that session?
Yeah, I imagine it, I'm not suggesting it would take an hour, but I just would like, I think in that session, it's probable that Member Ham in particular might just want to explore some questions, and that's really the purpose of it. It's not so much to make formal submissions to you, it's to give you a feel for it, perhaps show you some things, and let Member Ham and anyone else on the committee get a sense of it. We don't intend to put any of that in a written form or suggest that the committee would put any of that in a written form in its report. Okay,
thank you. My final question is relates to the scheduling. So the committee will, in the break, we will confer and come back to you with a proposed time that would suit the committee. So we would appreciate the opportunity to do what you're suggesting. So we'll confirm and discuss with you a time when we come back from the morning break. My question was to do with the Wednesday, the program for Wednesday. I did ask a couple of days ago if the proponent could give an indication of the time required if the whole day was intended to be used. And I think the essence of my question in this context is if it did need to be scheduled on the Wednesday, could that be accommodated in the context of the proponent's closing submissions?
Yes. If it was on the Wednesday, we would suggest that be a discrete session, whether that means you want to start at 9:30, for example, and go straight to that session and then start the hearing and say at 10:30 on the other link. That would be probably the neatest way to do it. We are also conscious, I think Member Ham's available in the morning on the Wednesday.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's obviously critical that Member Ham's part of this. So we would suggest it be a discrete listing. We can accommodate the Wednesday. It seemed neat to us to do it on the Tuesday and avoid having to have double hearing or links, but they're just logistics. So our preference is Tuesday, but we are very happy to accommodate the Wednesday morning.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend. So we'll come back to you on that. Thank you very much. Were there no further matters from you then in preliminary business this morning? No, thank you.
No, thank you.
Any other parties with any preliminary matters we need to discuss before moving into submissions from the Victorian National Parks Association? And I'll just check that our presenter, Jordan Cook, has presented status for when we get to him. You can see that he is in the room. So are those in charge of that? Thank you very much. I can see that's occurred. So just before I do come to you, Mr. Cook, I'll just check if any other party has any other preliminary matters. Looks like we're good to keep moving. So welcome, Mr. Cook. I'll get you to pop your camera on.
G'day.
Thank you for attending. Welcome. And as you know, we've received your hearing submission. Thank you, and your original submission as well. And I'll hand to you. You've got 20 minutes scheduled. If you could just leave some time for if the committee has some questions at the end.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'll try and share this screen. So can folks see the PowerPoint?
It's not showing the edges, Mr. Cook.
How's that?
That's great.
Great. Thanks for having me today. Yeah, and I'm here on behalf of the Victorian National Parks Association. Just before I start, I want to acknowledge that I'm on Gunai Kurnai country here in Gippsland. So the VMPA, just a quick intro to the VMPA, established in 1952, so it's 71 years old this year. And we're an independent, not-for-profit, not politically aligned, membership-based group. And we're very much focused on getting out into the parks to protect them. And just the introduction to me, I'm a park and nature advocate at the VMPA. I have a diploma in arboriculture, diploma in conservation land management, and a former lecturer at Swinburne University. So a quick summary of what I intend to go through is the history of the park, particularly the Hattah Kilkine National Park, the lack of assessments through the National Parks Act 1975, clearing of large trees and hollow bearing trees, the questionable use of the conservation exemption for native veg clearing, definition and of restoration and conservation, and ongoing management and governance of infrastructure. So Hattah Kilkine National Park is managed through a management plan like all national parks are, which is legislated under the National Parks Act. It is a Category 2 IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is a body made up of non-government organisations, government organisations from around the world. They come up with best practice conservation nature protection measures. So the park was established in 1960 and has had parts added ever since. And this is a large section of the park here, that part of the project, the VMFRP project, is set to be introduced to. And this is how national parks are managed. So national parks are meant to be our most highly protected level of land, particularly for conservation. And we do that by zoning national parks in the management plan, and we zone them to allow certain activities in some areas and not in others. And you can also see, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but these areas here, and Tarpaulin Island down here, and this area down here, these areas are known as reference areas. And these come under another set of legislation called the Reference Areas Act. In our analysis of the EES documents from the proponent, there was no assessment or the like regarding the reference areas, which is of quite large concern. So using the IUCN protected areas categories, national parks are pretty much the top and the highest level that we have to protect natural areas and scenic areas, as well as areas for education and recreation. So this is an area that's been managed as such since the 1960s. So the primary objective of a national park under Category 2 of the IUCN is to protect biodiversity with its underlying ecological structure and supporting environmental processes, and to promote education and recreation. And it's our belief that the VMFRP project doesn't meet those underlying objectives, particularly the ecological structure and supporting environmental processes. So the objectives of the National Parks Act that we have here in Victoria are pretty clear. Preservation and protection of natural environment, protection and preservation of Indigenous flora and fauna, and noting that that is not just those species listed on the EPBC and FFG Act. In a national park, all native plants and animals are protected, even if it's one of those naughty brush-tailed possums that lives in your roof. If it's in a national park, it's meant to be protected. And so far in the VMFRP documents that we've gone through, there has been no assessment of the project or any of the infrastructure through the objectives of the National Parks Act. So just to reiterate, no assessments in the National Parks Act and its objectives, nor any mention of the management plan, which is the key management tool for the national parks within the documents. So this is very disappointing, particularly the age of the park being established in the 1960s onwards, that it's just being treated like another patch of land when actually it is one of our highest level of protection for conservation land, and that helps us meet international obligations under the Convention for Biological Diversity. And it's missing in action in all these documents. As you can see, National Parks Act not found, and very scantily talked about within other documents, and management plan missing in action altogether. One of the other very concerning aspects of the project is the large-scale removal and clearing of large old trees and hollow-bearing trees, and this can be seen as nothing but a long-term cumulative impact. So just for the Balsa Youngera Adda Lakes North part alone, there's over 400, close to 500 large old trees and over 120 hollow bearing trees that are set to be cleared. And in the whole project as a whole, almost 5,000 hollow bearing and large trees are set to be removed. Working as an ecologist and a consulting arborist personally, I've worked on projects like the Westgate Tunnel, Metro Tunnel, and many road widening projects. This is, I've never seen anything to the scale of this, particularly within a national park, of this level of clearing of hollow bearing trees. In those other projects, we've been able to move roads, including the Westgate Tunnel, 15 metres away from significant habitat trees, and it doesn't seem to have been done in this respect. Another document, an assessment missing throughout the EES documents from the proponent, is the action statement through the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act that lists the loss of hollow bearing trees from Victorian native forests and woodlands as a key threatening process. There was no assessment done through the EES in regards to reducing the impact on hollow bearing trees and to try and meet the objectives of this action statement. These trees take a long time. This sulphur-crested cockatoo is a large bird. The tree has to be large enough to hold the hollow, to hold this animal. And a lot of the time, that is over 120 years old. The proponent has put forward a concept that the tree health and more hollow bearing trees will grow, but in the meantime, it's unclear where these animals will reside, particularly the larger animals like the lace mitre and regent parrot that require large hollows. So these animals might live 30, 40 years at the most. They're not going to be able to procreate and find anywhere else to live while they're waiting for these trees to grow large enough to hold the hollows. So this section in the conclusion of the biodiversity effects section of the EES kind of says it all. Nature in the national park, where the risk of this project, direct habitat is lost, particularly through the loss of the hollow bearing trees and native vegetations. Ecosystems and communities are damaged while we wait 120 years for those trees to be restored in the landscape. And the use of the adaptive management is very good in on the paperwork, but when it comes to happening in like in management, in works, is quite a dangerous, well-meaning but dangerous thing. Are we going to go around and monitor every tree, every plant, and once the trees have been flooded once and another flood comes through and these trees die, are we going to end up with paddocks of dead trees like this when we've been promised recruitment and a conservation offset resulting in more habitat? As Mr. Frood talked about a few days ago, there's many examples of these projects going wrong, and if this project goes wrong, it goes wrong on a very large scale, impacts one of our most beautiful national parks, and is very concerning that we're trying to turn a national park with natural systems and natural ecosystem function into like a regulated floodplain, a regulated almost like a garden. We're trying to treat it, and in that respect, the project can't be called a restoration project, nor is it being done in the name of conservation. So it's doesn't meet even the basic principles of good ecological restoration as put forth by the Society of Ecological Restoration and the IUCN. They emphasise process repair over structural replacement, allowing sufficient time for self-generation, treating the cause rather than the symptoms of the degradation. This process and these projects are trying to make the rivers more convenient for human management, when really we could just give them more water. Nor does it meet the terms of nature conservation. And as Mr. Frood highlighted, it's the little things in biodiversity, the diversity in biodiversity that we could lose and play a massive gamble with if this project was to go ahead at the scale that it's proposed. So the use of the conservation loophole doesn't stack up. It's not appropriate. The project is akin to an experiment, and these type of large scale experiments have no place in our national parks, particularly in the habitat of rare and threatened species. And as someone who's worked on large projects like this, in my opinion, it seems that the conservation loophole in the native veg regulations have been used as a way to clear more habitat instead of trying to reduce the project's footprint and the project's impact. This would never be allowed to fly closer to Melbourne, the clearing of 4,500 hollow-bearing trees, let alone one hollow-bearing tree. This project will cause, in our opinion, more harm than good, because the work hasn't been done at the finer levels to understand the full-scale impact. The simplification of EVCs is a very much could happen, and the work hasn't been done. The loss of all these hollow-bearing trees is very much like a flashing light of warning that if you can't avoid clearing 4,500 hollow-bearing trees, what else is going on? So the use of the NSEM tool and the habitat hectares tools to prove the positive outcomes is also very rough and misses the finer details. It misses the diversity and biodiversity, and you can see the Algaris butterfly is copying the wrong end of the stick with this proposal, and has been missed out in the NSEM tool, and also the simplification of the EVCs with particular species. Mr. Frood raised these issues as well, that not all the plants that have been assessed are flood dependent, particularly the black box, and these water regimes won't fit all the natural life cycles of those plants. Another issue that we've found is the ongoing management and governance of the infrastructure. It's set to be managed under Section 27 under the National Parks Act if it's given to the proponent to build the infrastructure. And in our opinion, this will substantially affect the park. It's an effect that doesn't, there's no doubt that this project will substantially change ecosystem functions, species and floristic diversity of the park and reduce its diversity. So the decision making so far in what we've found in the EES is it doesn't seem to listen to all the voices, nor does it have the ecological needs of the ecosystems or the park at its core. Who gets to turn on the tap? It just seems to sound like it's a process of a ticker box kind of process. There's no consent procedures that include public or traditional owner input. So it's all up to the CMA with no necessarily input from the community or the greater scientific community either. There's also no complementary management, which is we flood these areas, pest, plants and animals are going to go nuts. Is Parks Victoria meant to find the money for that management within its already small budget, or is the proponent going to front up the costs for those complementary management needs once the areas have been flooded? And I guess this diagram, or dog's breakfast, it really shows how complex these ecosystems are, and that trying to simplify them and make them convenient for human management, instead of just giving them the much needed water that they need, instead of increasing the regulation of them, could have quite a large impact on them. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Crook. I'll just see if any of the committee members have questions. Great. I'll come to Member Bell. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Crook.
Thank you.
Could you please clarify your submission regarding the non-use of the procedure for the removal, destruction of or lopping of native vegetation on Crown land for use by DELP and Parks Vic, in the context that the removal will not be undertaken by DELP or Parks Vic?
I might have to take that one on notice, but we find it very weird that no offset procedures have been used, rather than the conservation loopholes being used very questionably.
Okay, I understand that.
Just to clarify, Mr. Crook, we won't need you to take any questions on notice. So if you're able to answer them, that's great. And if not, that's fine as well.
Sorry, and that clarifies. So just to follow up, but it might be related to that answer, could you just clarify your submission as to how applying that procedure would affect the assessment of this project?
Using even the Crown land exemption, there would have to be a process of avoid and minimise, which we haven't really been able to find in the proponent's documents so far. And there would have to be a offset happen within the parks estate or within public land using that tool. Doesn't necessarily become a vegetation for vegetation, but there could be another offset such as pest management or the like, which won't happen with the current arrangements being put forth by the proponent.
Okay, so are you familiar with the environmental management framework?
I've looked at it, I've glanced at it, yeah.
And the pest, plant and animal procedure proposed there is, could you just, clarify your submission on that?
I guess we're worried I guess Mr. Frew put it best, the foundations and then the house. The foundations aren't fully set. The underlying issues and impacts are there. We don't know what the effects are going to be. So how can we plan for them? We can't reverse the impacts once they've happened.
I understand.
Yeah. So.
Thank you. With respect to the National Park and its management plan, I note that it does recognise an aim to restore a more natural hydrological regime to the area. What are the management priorities to protect the conservation values of the National Park especially around that hydrological regime question or issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the question here is, are these going to be ecologically right flows and regimes when someone decides when to turn on and turn off the tap, and we're pushing water up into higher levels than they most likely naturally did. So it's questionable whether these are going to be natural flows when you've got the chance of pooling and black water events. It's not necessarily flowing. It looks like it will sit for periods of time. And I guess conservation, you want to protect ecosystems and biodiversity as a whole. This could end up with the simplification of EVCs, and the loss of the hollow bearing trees as well is definitely not a conservation outcome.
And so are you aware in the management plan what the proposed actions are or management strategies to restore that hydrological regime?
I'd have to have a look.
That's okay. I guess it's not your understanding that a project like this was contemplated to address that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the project isn't necessarily, as we put forth, it's not necessarily being done for conservation and restoration. It's being done to make the ecosystems use the water in a more efficient way. When the ecosystems have regulated and managed themselves for many years, we could just give them more water and they know how to use it naturally.
Thank you. And in particular to the reference areas, so the Reference Area Act kind of notes that those areas should be preserved in its natural state as far as possible because of ecological interest. So it might be a similar submission, but just to be sure, third submissions that the floodplain is not currently in a natural state as it's been starved of water. So what's your submission regarding the natural state of the reference sites and how that can be achieved?
Yes. Yep.
Same as previous?
Yep.
Thanks. Are you aware if a plan has been developed for how those reference areas should be protected or controlled?
No.
Thanks. And just finally, in response to submissions regarding the loss of hollow bearing trees, and specifically a submission from DECA for a hollow replacement plan, the proponent's expert gave evidence that due to the surrounding context of a large number of hollow bearing trees, such a plan was not warranted to mitigate a significant effect on the fauna. Would you like to respond to that?
I guess you've got the action statement there under the FFG Act, and to remove a hollow because there's another hollow nearby doesn't necessarily mean the hollow nearby is of good use for the wildlife in the area. The size and aspects of those hollows might be different, and we need more hollow bearing trees in the landscape, not less, particularly for those rarer species that need to occupy quite a few different hollows across their breeding and movement periods. So that's a very concerning way of looking at things, that we can lose these hollows because these hollows are here already. So we need to retain as many as possible in the landscape to keep that ecosystem resilience.
Yeah. And in your experience, you noted your experience with, I think, the Westgate Tunnel project. Was it the case that you were provided a road alignment and had to look kind of where realignments could be made, or were you given a project area and decided what the path of least resistance ecologically would be?
Yes, I undertook tree surveys as an arborist and ecologist. We found a group of Norfolk Island hibiscus, so not native trees, and these trees were being used by grey-headed flying fox, so EPVCF listed species, and we recommended that the road be moved 15 metres away outside of the tree protection zone of those trees to retain those trees for their importance for those species and their legislative protections. And yeah, the developer at the time agreed with that and moved the road instead of clearing the habitat. So yeah, it was a pre-road kind of survey.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Cook, for coming along and presenting to the committee this morning. We really appreciate it. And there's no further questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. So our next submitter, I'll just make sure, I think we need both Professor Piddock and so I'll get you to introduce yourselves on you're on the one camera there. So welcome from the Fenner School, or representing the Fenner School of Environment and Society. So we have got your hearing submission, as you're aware, and I'll hand directly to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Madam Chair, committee members, thank you for the opportunity to present to you. We're speaking to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in the Upper Murrumbidgee upstream of these project sites. We pay our respects to the traditional owners, elders past and present here, and also along the Dungala River Murray in the vicinity of these proposed projects. My name's Jamie Piddock. I'm a Professor of Environmental Science and Policy at the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University. My background training was in physical geography, including fluvial geomorphology and paleontology, but my current research is focused on water management for biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin.
Madam Chair, committee members, my name's Matthew Koloff. I'm an honorary senior lecturer at Fenner School of Environment and Society. Prior to that, I spent 23 years in CSIRO, and my background is in floodplain ecology, wetlands, water reform policy in the Murray-Darling Basin and elsewhere, and also impacts of climate change on conservation and adaptation to climate change more generally.
Madam Chair, we might just share screen here and refer to our presentation.
Thank you.
Can I check that you can see the presentation and hear us adequately?
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Fantastic. Madam Chair, the obvious question in this hearing is, isn't it self-evident that watering wetlands is a good thing to do for their conservation? And certainly Dr. Koloff and I argue that there is an immense challenge that the Victorian government and others face in terms of adequately watering wetland ecosystems with a limited and potentially declining water availability. We do object to these two projects as presented, however, and we'd like to take you through 4 key points for your consideration. The first point we wish to make is that the projects are designed to reduce environmental water volumes in the River Murray system and will have significant impacts on matters of national environmental significance further downriver as a result. The second point we would make is that these projects are not designed as ecological restoration or adaptive management projects, and we think that they need to be significantly reconsidered. We believe there are key technical flaws in the proponent's proposal, and we're particularly concerned that the proponent does not appear to have thoroughly examined what we see as a very viable alternative. I'll take those 4 points now in turn. But before I do that, I note that in their opening presentation, the proponent, through Mr. Townshend, expressed the question of whether this is an onerous process, overly onerous for such a clearly benign set of developments. We would point out that this is not the first time that this kind of re-engineering of the floodplain for conservation has been tried, and the results have not always been satisfactory. So I refer in particular to the Living Murray program and offer these two examples. So one of the projects under consideration here at Hatter North, part of this is largely focused on reoperating the Bitterang stop bank. That stop bank was built as part of the Living Murray project to prevent watering of the Lake Bulka system. And so in many respects, the North Hatter project is about fixing a major mistake of the previous attempts to conserve floodplain wetlands through engineering. As another example, a little bit upriver and in New South Wales is the Kundrook Paracuda Living Murray project, where a reported $120 million has been spent building this extraordinary infrastructure. Just one of the regulators is pictured here. This has essentially been inoperable. It's only been partly operated twice in the more than a decade it's been built. We believe that the federal government has recently, last year, allocated another $30 million to try and rectify the problems with this. And this floodplain engineering project hasn't been subject to any public or independent review. The reports that we have from local stakeholders are that it's failed because the proponents didn't adequately assess the hydrology of how the engineering structures would work, that they failed to get adequate agreements with private landholders whose land would be inundated. And of course, there's a moral failing in not having adequately consulted the traditional owners. So with that background, let's move on to our 4 points. This suite of projects, the Sustainable Diversion Limit Adjustment Mechanism projects, were conceived to reduce environmental water. And I note that the government's adopted them at a point when they explicitly made no consideration of the impacts of climate change on water availability. And as the Murray-Darling Basin Authority presenter in the opening days of this hearing presented, the idea is that these projects will reduce real environmental water recovery with paper water offsets, and that amounts to about 19% of the environmental water to be recovered under the basin plan. The loss of this water has significant impacts on downstream ecosystems. Now, this rather complicated figure shows the peak flows at the South Australian border needed to inundate different areas of different kinds of floodplain wetland ecosystems. And you can see that between 60,000 and 80,000 megalitres a day at the South Australian border, there's a very significant difference in the amount of wetland ecosystems that can be conserved through managed watering. And so the loss of further volumes of real environmental water does have potentially significant consequences in terms of sustaining downstream wetland ecosystems. And so,
Peter, we're just having a few audio issues. Your audio is dropping, the volume's dropping occasionally to the point it's very difficult to hear you. I don't know if there's anything else you can do to, I don't think it's that you're moving around. I'm not sure what the issue is. If you've got a microphone that you could plug in, that might assist.
indeed, I'll get closer. Madam Chair, is that better?
It is for now. I'll let you know if it continues to be a problem.
Excellent. I will use my best lecturing voice. So the loss of this water is significant. We note that the Victorian Murray Floodplain Restoration Program is being considered as providing 120 gigalitres a year reduction of environmental water under the Basin Plan. And these two projects in particular are 5 gigalitres a year less environmental water in the River Murray system. I note the South Australian Royal Commission on the Murray-Darling Basin questioned the merits of this program. So more specifically, this figure shows the different environmental water recovery targets that the governments have considered for the River Murray system, including the 3,200 gigalitres a year adopted in the 2012 Basin Plan. The blue-green line at the bottom there represents the actual volumes of additional environmental water recovered under the basin reforms, and you can see that they fall far short of the environmental water targets. And so the additional loss of 5 gigalitres, if these two projects were to be approved, is part of that cumulative impact or loss for the environment. We contend that the proponents have misunderstood the issues in relation to the downstream Ramsar sites. In Specialist Assessment C and Appendix G, they have focused only on the Riverland and Banrock Ramsar sites. In responses to submissions, the proponents have said these Ramsar sites are a long way downstream and that the watering to sustain those sites is a matter for local water managers to prioritise. Now, in this, they're relying on the ecological equivalence method adopted by state and federal governments to justify putting less water on wetlands. We contend, the Royal Commission in South Australia contended that this method is not fit for purpose for a number of reasons. One is that it doesn't assess the cumulative impact of the loss of that environmental water moving downstream. There are a number of other scientific failings we would be more than happy to elaborate on in questions. So one of the key values that's at risk is flushing flows, because you need real water, obviously, to flush salt and can't rely on paper water. The proponents haven't assessed the loss of this water, for example, for the Coorong, Lakes Alexandrina and Albert Ramsar site. In the ecological character description adopted for this Ramsar site by the South Australian and Commonwealth governments, they clearly identify a limit of acceptable change related to flushing the system to maintain adequate salinity levels. The South Australian government in 2012 commissioned research to look at what different levels of real environmental water recovery would mean in terms of sustaining the ecological character. And that concluded that only the provision of larger volumes, up to 3,200 gigalitres a year, reduces the number and duration of consecutive years when salinity thresholds are exceeded. And as you saw from the previous slide, that volume of water is not being recovered, and the prospects of it being recovered are diminished if these two projects were to be approved. Just a side note here, this process is obviously very Victorian-centric. I draw your attention to two matters of federal law and definition. One is that under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, assessment is required of potential significant impacts on the ecological character of Ramsar wetlands. And that ecological character may depend on and extend beyond the legally recognised boundaries of the wetlands. And so in the case of Hatta, for example, the whole system could be regarded as a Ramsar wetland, not just the individual lakes that are listed. In terms of wetlands, the Victorian government persists in using a very narrow definition of wetlands. That is not the definition, the broader definition of the Ramsar Convention, or indeed under federal law. And that might be helpful in framing your advice. And so floodplain forests are recognised internationally and federally as wetlands. Let me now turn to the question of whether these downstream impacts I've spoken about should be a matter for your deliberations. The proponent has argued in response to submissions that these may not be relevant, yet the proponent in the environmental impact statement has in a number of instances assessed these broader questions. And in particular, I note the socioeconomic argument that they present in figure 7 in the summary, where they contend that if these projects don't go ahead and if the extra environmental water is recovered, there would be a major economic impact. So I guess I'd say two things about that. One is that the economic consultancy report that they rely on uses a very flawed methodology. And in the document I tabled this morning, we received yesterday advice from Professor Sarah Wheeler, Australia's arguably leading academic on water market economics, where she outlines flaws in their methodology and says those results should not be relied upon. Secondly, we would argue that if the proponent can say that keeping that water from the environment is significant, then the impact of removing this water from the environment is also a matter that should be the subject of the committee's deliberations. Let me move on to our second point, and that is our contention that these projects are not designed for restoration or adaptive management. Now, I'm sure that might surprise you, but we would say that, firstly, the selection of these 3,000 odd hectares to be the subject of the purported restoration is ad hoc. If this was a restoration program, we would expect the proponents to fall back on conservation first principles and construct an argument around restoration of the habitat of particular threatened species, to look at the representativeness of the ecosystems, to ensure that a representative sample of the wetland ecological vegetation classes are conserved. The proponents don't do that. Their proposition amounts to just add water to the floodplain, and that is restoration. They certainly go through and list the species and ecological vegetation classes that they think will be inundated and might benefit, but they don't actually set any restoration targets that would be essential in terms of an adaptive management regime, any sort of intended benefit that could be measured to ensure that what is proposed achieves what it's meant to achieve, and if not, that adjustments could be made. The proponents have relied a lot on arguments that the Living Murray project at Hatta Lakes has been a success. Again, we would question that. The proponents have certainly referred to a lot of government reports and reports from consultants that the governments have funded. We can't find any peer-reviewed evaluation of how these existing floodplain engineering projects have worked, and that is best available science. Essentially, the reports we're being pointed to, we would argue, are government agencies marking their own homework. And then lastly, if this really were a restoration and adaptive management project, then we would look to see things like targets for restoration, limits of acceptable change and so forth, that are then part of an adaptive management cycle. Our argument is that those are missing in the current proposal. I'd like now to move on to our third point. This is that there are a number of key technical flaws in the proponents' arguments. Let me begin first in terms of the hydrological modelling. Most of the modelling that the proponent has presented is based on the source Murray model. This model, we argue, is not fit for purpose. And let me outline why. One is that when assessments have been undertaken of what the model projects in terms of water in the river compared to the water actually observed in the river, there are major differences. In this Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists report from 2020, for example, at Hatter, they found that over the 7 years of basin plan operation, that the amount of water actually in the River Murray was 23% less than the basin models projected. As Dr. Treadwell concurred in the cross-examination of his presentation, the model is over a decade old and has not been updated or refined, for example, to include changes in river operating rules implemented by state governments. And for this reason, the state and federal governments have commenced a model uplift program. And I think that flags to us that the current model is insufficient for this kind of project planning. Let me now turn to the way the proponent has treated climate change. This Murray-Darling Basin Authority figure presents changes in water availability in the River Murray since 1900. And as you can see, average flows in the last 20 years are considerably below the long-term historical record. The SIDLAM program was adopted in 2012, where that red asterisk is, and the governments at the time explicitly said that they were going to rely on the historical record and not consider potential climate change impacts in designing this program. More specifically, in terms of these projects, the proponent relies on a number of climate change assessments in Specialist Assessment C and then in Dr. Treadwell's evidence. I think if members examine the references that they rely on, you'll find that there's two types of arguments. One is an argument that in recent history, river inflows have been declining. And then the second argument is that we should rely on a series of reports that largely are based on CSIRO scenarios for future climate change in the basin. So those scenarios include scenarios that range from wet to dry conditions. These are very high-level storylines and quite simplistic. Importantly, CSIRO does not assign any probability to any of these scenarios, and so neither the wet nor the dry scenarios are more or less likely. In these reports, the proponent has conflated all overbank flows, and so you will see that they have largely lumped together those small and medium overbank flow events, and there's no doubt that they have declined with a changing climate, with river regulation and with excessive consumptive water extraction. But they have lumped those together with the larger uncontrolled events such as that we've experienced this past summer. And none of the modelling presented looks at the future frequency of large uncontrolled events. Now, nearly all of my scientific colleagues would say that they consider it likely that the frequency of large extreme events, both droughts and floods, is likely to increase with climate change. The argument for these engineering interventions is that they will enable water in particular to be moved onto the higher floodplain. We would argue that the climate change information presented by the proponent is insufficient to reach the conclusion that will be required. Let me turn to our last point, and that is that there is a very good alternative. And so we totally agree that there is a need for managed watering of the wetlands on the floodplain in the River Murray system. There's a spectrum of wetland watering options, each of which is proposed or practiced in the basin. And they range from legal protection of a free-flowing river, as the Victorian government has done with the Ovens River, through to these intensive interventions proposed with these engineering works. Now, each of these kinds of interventions has costs and benefits and risks. And so the engineering works have very high risks. For example, it requires, beyond the actual construction, essentially we're saying that the Victorian government agencies each year forever will employ staff to turn the taps the right way on these structures forever. Big engineering structures on a floodplain degrade and are very expensive to maintain. So there's very high operating costs. And so if, as a society, we choose to approve this kind of project, we're accepting the risk that a future government, Victorian agencies are jeffed again, who's going to pay for and maintain these structures? There's a path dependency with these structures. Once you've built them, they're very, very hard to undo. Our argument is that there's a better alternative, and it is government policy in the Basin Constraints Management Strategy. So in 2013 or so, the state and federal governments agreed that in these 7 areas in the Murray-Darling Basin, that they would work to remove operational and physical barriers to enable managed pulse releases from dams to fill up the river channels and spill over onto the floodplains and water them. Now, clearly the New South Wales and Victorian government implementation of these commitments is way behind schedule. I would point you to the evidence of Dr. Treadwell in cross-examination, where he acknowledged in this project area where these projects are proposed that the constraints relaxation that has been agreed for the Murrumbidgee and for the River Murray could result in peak flows in the Hatter area of 700,000 or more megalitres a day flow. And that would enable, in Dr. Treadwell's words, watering of wetlands up to the sort of intermediate elevation on the floodplains. Now, I'm astonished that the proponent hasn't modelled this alternative to see, in the case of these 2 projects, how much of the floodplain area could be conserved with these managed pulsed flows. Clearly, it wouldn't be all of the area that is the subject of these 2 projects, but we contend it would be a very, very significant portion of the 2 wetlands could be well conserved in this way without the engineering impacts that you have been considering. My last and important point here is that this approach would enable watering and conservation of a vastly larger area, an order of magnitude bigger area of wetlands in the floodplain along the River Murray than the 14,000 hectares that would be watered that's in the command area of the proposed Victorian Murray floodplain restoration program. So let me conclude then with these 5 points. Our argument is that the SIDLAM projects are primarily designed to significantly reduce basin environmental water recovery, and that this will have negative impacts on matters of national environmental significance regulated under the EPBC Act downstream along the River Murray. I've pointed specifically to the example of the Coorong and Lakes Alexandrina and Albert Ramsar site, but the same logic would apply to many other matters of national environmental significance along the river. We argue that key components of the case are not fit for purpose, and we've pointed to the environmental equivalence method, the inadequate river flow modelling, the restoration claims, and the rather loose climate change projections. We are arguing that constraints relaxation is a better alternative that can conserve more of the floodplain wetlands with less negative consequences. And so we're urging the panel not to recommend approval for the projects as they are presented. Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pittock. So we do have a few questions from the committee, and I'll ask Member Bell to start.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
In relation to your slide 7, effects of ecological character of Ramsar wetlands, you've got that some values may be significantly impacted, for example, fewer flushing flows to manage salinity. Can you please clarify the locations that this statement refers to?
So a specific example would be the Coorong itself, where there's a fine balance in the salinity of the water of that lagoon that tips the balance between the growth of seagrasses that is the basis of the food chain, for example, for a number of the water birds that form the ecological character of that Ramsar site. And so unless the salinity is maintained in the right band, then there are real ecological consequences. And so that's why the ecological character description and the South Australian Government assessment has focused on that in particular. More generally, the Ramsar sites in the Riverland region of South Australia are threatened by rising salinity levels. Overbank flows are essential to firstly pick up much of that salt and flush it out to sea, and that's why the basin plan includes targets for the volume of salt to be flushed out to sea on a rolling 3-year basis. Targets, I might add, that have rarely been achieved since the basin plan's been adopted. And so the broader floodplain in South Australia is at risk from that build-up of salt without those overbank flushing flows.
Thank you. So does that encompass that broader area? Does that encompass, in addition to the Coorong, Lakes Alexandria and the Albert Ramsar site, are there any other Ramsar sites in that area?
Yeah, so the Banrock Ramsar site further upstream and the Riverland Ramsar site in the Chowla wetland area are among those where there are salinity issues. Beyond the formally listed Ramsar sites, other wetlands along the South Australian River have quite severe salinity issues.
Thank you. Sorry, just capturing it. In relation to slide 11, sorry. Thank you. You say there is no monitoring and evaluation framework for the adaptive management. What are the elements of a monitoring and evaluation framework for adaptive management which are missing from the EES EMF and or the ecological MER document?
Sorry, in order to conduct an effective strategic adaptive management program, you've got to have a system of continual monitoring of your the effect of your actions on your restoration targets without setting baseline criteria around what your targets for restoration are and what the current status of the ecosystems are and what you're attempting to achieve, any monitoring and evaluation program will be meaningless. So effectively, the issue is not so much just the lack of a considered and thought through monitoring and evaluation program. It goes to the very fundamentals that we're asserting that this is not a restoration project because it hasn't set those fundamental principles around what those targets are and what kind of condition the proponents are attempting to restore those wetlands to.
Thank you. So in just picking up on that, does that mean that regardless of a 5-year baseline that the ecological MERS speaks to having collected or being collected, the key deficiency in your opinion is the lack of clear targets? Well,
no, it goes beyond that. If you look at world's best practice on strategic adaptive management, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, there is a feedback loop between the data collected and how that is then used by managers. And that then becomes an issue of governance. They have to be in place amongst the various agencies who are responsible for managing a particular environmental asset, governance processes that allow them to learn and adapt and consider what adaptation actions that they can change to rectify any unexpected effects. But also it requires putting in place what have been called thresholds of potential concern and limits of acceptable change. And thresholds of potential concern might be if a particular area has not been watered for a particular period of time that might be outside the immediate area that's impacted by the works and measures. A threshold of potential concern allows managers to assess whether their actions are moving the system towards the desired outcomes for restoration or away from. It requires a lot more than just what we've seen in the documentation presented by the proponent, which is essentially the invoking of adaptive management in very broad terms as a solution that could be implemented down the track.
Thank you. Slide 15, the inadequacy of climate change impact projections. You've got these reports and the proponent conflate the overbank flows largely controlled by dams versus larger uncontrolled events. Can you explain what you mean by that statement?
Thank you, yes. So currently the governments choose not to release water from dams in ways that will fill up the river channel and spill over bank and inundate private land because of their concern for the impacts on private landholders. And so the combination of reduced inflows due to climate change, the governments not using the environmental water that they have acquired in the period of basin reforms, and their unwillingness without agreement to flood private land means that they are largely attempting not to allow these small and intermediate flows down the river system. So essentially they're desiccating the floodplain. So the climate change projections, the historical modellers that have been presented show that the number of these small events in the past 2 decades has declined substantially. The constraints management strategy is directly intended to address that by reaching agreement with riverside landholders to enable watering of their lands and enable water managers, particularly the Victorian and New South Wales governments, to release environmental water impulses to mimic and replace those missing small and medium-sized floodplain flows. Have I answered your question, Member Bell, or have I addressed the topic there?
And sorry, I'm madly typing as well, so sorry if I'm not nodding enough. On the same slide, you've got that no modelling is presented of the frequency of uncontrolled events, such as experienced this summer. Can you please explain how you differentiate between controlled and uncontrolled flow events? Even the largest flood events are to some degree affected by the presence and operation of existing water infrastructure.
So the work that the different governments have commissioned, largely from CSIRO, talks about future climate change in terms of scenarios. And in those scenarios, you will see that they talk about reduced inflows that then mean that those flow pulses can be more readily regulated, and so that there would then be fewer, if you like, natural or wild overbank flooding events. The modelling, the scenarios that have been prepared don't distinguish between those small and medium-sized flood events that can be regulated as opposed to the more extreme flood events that, as we've seen this summer, will reach up to and inundate the highest levels of the floodplains. And so I guess our contention here is that by lumping these together, they're not allowing us to judge whether relaxed constraints will be sufficient to water the managed floodplains, and whether it's premature to say, on the other hand, that large flood events are reducing in number and thereby jeopardising watering of the upper floodplain.
Just an additional point, Member Bell. The Murray-Darling Basin Authority, in terms of definition of what is an uncontrolled event, Murray-Darling Basin Authority puts out a weekly report on flows in the Murray and its tributaries, and they identify and have clear criteria for what constitutes an uncontrolled event, and that may involve dam spillage, or it may involve sufficient flows into upper headwater dams that require the authority to release water from those dams to create headspace. So the determination of those sorts of events is pretty clear cut, and could have been modelled.
Thank you. In relation to slide 16 with the constraints relaxation, I'm sorry, you may have touched on this in one of your other answers, but obviously I pre-prepared these. So is your submission that the constraints relaxation could recover enough water to inundate the project areas, or simply that the amount of water that may be recoverable from these measures needs to be considered prior to project design?
So constraints relaxation doesn't recover water per se. It's about using the existing environmental water more effectively to inundate a larger area of wetlands. So currently, much of the environmental water the governments have acquired in the past decade is dribbled out of dams and kept within the river channel, which is potentially great for fish, but it doesn't get the water out onto the hundreds of thousands of hectares of floodplain wetlands. And so those are being desiccated, particularly below the Barmah Narrows in the region of Victoria that we're talking about. I think you were also asking about the 5 gigalitres that would less environmental water that would be recovered if these 2 projects are approved. And what essentially that would mean is if the projects don't proceed, currently the federal government's obliged to recover that extra 5 gigalitres, and that would add to the pool of environmental water available for watering events. If the projects are approved and those 5 gigalitres become paper water offsets, then that's less water that will be available to water downstream wetlands.
Yeah, sorry, my question might not have been clear. I understand the way that you've described the constraints relaxation and using that environmental water more effectively. Do you think that that environmental water could be used using the constraints relaxation mechanism to water these project areas?
In both cases, significant portions of these project areas would be watered with peak flows of the magnitude that are proposed at Hatter. So in cross-examination, Dr. Treadwell talked about potential peak flows of 70,000 megalitres a day at Hatter or more. That would water a significant portion of the Belsey-Yungara area. In the case of Hatter, you may recall a discussion that Dr. Treadwell and I had about the threshold to spill into the wetland and our question about whether that was 20 or 30,000 megalitres a day. Regardless, a 70,000 megalitre a day event is more than enough to spill into Hatter and water some of that area. The question is, what portion of the floodplain area? It certainly wouldn't be high enough to get onto the highest elevation areas that are the focus of this project. And indeed, the proponent might argue, well, that's about representative conservation of different kinds of wetland EVCs. But I note the proponent hasn't made that case. They haven't done the sort of homework that, for example, the Victorian Environment Assessment Council did in its Red Gum Forest review in recommending areas to protect as parks. They haven't said what's the total proportion of each EVC and how do we direct conservation measures to conserve a representative range of them. Here we're simply being told that these 9 Victorian Murray Floodplain Restoration Program sites are good and should be watered, but we don't have the context among the hundreds of thousands of hectares of floodplain wetlands along the River Murray as to why these 3,000 hectares and not others.
Can I just add a point to what my colleague said about the issues around constraints management and constraints relaxation? A couple of years ago, we undertook a detailed audit of environmental water use in the Murray-Darling Basin, and what became very clear from that data was that the overall holdings of water by the Commonwealth amounting to around about 2,000 gigalitres a year, some of which is on paper. But if you then assess the long-term average annual yield that comes from those water holdings, it's in the order of around about 1,800, 1,900 gigalitres. If you actually look at the amount of water the Commonwealth is able to release in the Southern Basin, i.e. along the River Murray, it comes in way under that, around about 1,500 gigalitres. And it's very clear from our conversations with our colleagues at the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office that were constraints relaxed, they would be able to put more environmental water down the river system.
Mm. And to put that in another context, we've also assessed where every parcel of Commonwealth environmental water was released in the first 7 years or so. And essentially in the basin as a whole, only around 2% of the area of basin wetlands per year were receiving managed environmental flows. And that suggests to us that this kind of project is insufficient if as a society we want to conserve a higher proportion of the wetlands in the basin and a broader range of the different wetland ecosystem types.
Thank you. In your original submission on page 4, you've mentioned the River Murray flow levels at which these projects are proposed to operate is a clear demonstration that they were not designed in concert with the basin plan. For instance, the Belsa-Younger is designed to operate with increased frequency and duration of flows, but the stream flow indicators derived from the hydrological indicator sites in this reach of the River Murray. Could you please clarify how the stream flow indicators are derived from the hydrological indicator sites and where those sites are?
Okay, this is one.
Professor Pittock, apologies, I'm just going to interrupt for a moment. I'm just mindful of the time and we are struggling to stick to the timetable. I'm happy for us to continue for a few minutes and I have a few quick questions as well. So if I could just ask you to be as brief as possible in your reply.
So the brief answer is that the water recovery levels set when the basin plan was being developed were built around 121 hydrologic indicator sites that the governments agreed at different points along the rivers in the basin. And there's a couple of those sites near these two projects. The governments then had experts identify the so-called stream flow levels that would be needed to conserve the biodiversity of that cross-section of the river at each site. And that was used to identify the water recovery levels, ultimately leading to the 3,200 gigalitre a year target. What the authority, in commenting on earlier business plans for these two projects, said to the Victorian government proponents was that the flooding frequency the Victorian government was proposing wasn't the same as what had been agreed with the adjacent stream flow indicators. Now, I haven't done the subsequent assessment as to whether in this EIS the Victorian government has further amended that flooding frequency to meet the basin plan stream flow indicators or not.
Thank you. And finally, with the source Murray model, if you added more recent data, including the Millennium Drought and this flood, would the Millennium Drought skew the data too much as an event, and would the flood balance it out?
I don't know if I wouldn't like to predict the effects of the drought on the source model. I'm simply not sufficiently familiar with the detailed operations of that model to be able to make that prediction. Sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
That's okay. Thank you. I have no further questions.
Because the source Murray model is 22 subsidiary, largely state government-owned models sort of bolted together at the border. And so your question probably requires 22 sets of amendments to models and linking it together again.
Thank you. Thank you both for your time. No further questions from me.
Thank you,
Member Bell. I just have a few quick questions. I'll make them brief and ask again for you to be as brief as possible in responding. Just continuing looking at this or your views on the source Murray model, and I'm interested to know how it matters, the model currently being outdated. Why does that matter to this project?
So one One reason why it might matter is that there might be less water anticipated in the river than the proponent plans on, and so it may mean that the infrastructure can be operated less frequently than the proponent proposes. It also gets to questions of how frequently the water conditions would be adequate to dilute things like blackwater events and salinity buildup.
In relation to the source model, but in terms of its upgrade and whether that upgrade will take into account effects of climate change, one of the concerns I've had long-standing in relation to environmental water use in the Southern Basin is that environmental water is released at periods of high river flow when irrigation water is being sent downriver to Western Victoria and South Australia. That typically happens in late summer. Traditionally, floods occurred during late winter and early spring, and that's the period in which most organisms that are adapted to live on floodplains and in wetlands tend to respond positively. Also, the evaporative loss that comes from environmental water releases in late summer is very high. These are the sorts of things that need to be considered as part of the overall modelling framework, and they're not.
Okay, thank you. Regarding climate change consideration, are you of the view that this could be adequately managed, or this future scenarios through appropriate adaptive management program?
I don't think we have any choice but to have an adaptive management program because water availability is changing. The system's highly regulated, and we do need to achieve our social, economic and environmental objectives with potentially less water. Certainly with changing water conditions, we have to adapt. So I think the answer is we have no choice.
Yeah.
Thank you, that's clear. And my final question relates to the information you circulated this morning from the advice from Professor Wheeler. I'm just interested to understand what you see the implications are of that.
So the Victorian government has expressed a view that allocating more water to the environment would come at a large economic cost to the state. And that is one of the reasons why the Victorian government proposed the SIDLAM program, and where is the origins of these two projects, the 5 gigalitres. They have relied on economic consultants to form the view that the economic impact would be great. And so the critique that has been offered by Professor Wheeler, I think, cuts to the heart of the trade-offs involved in this project. She is saying that the economic impact is exaggerated. I would go beyond Professor Wheeler's assessment to say that the Victorian government hasn't assessed the economic benefits of a healthier river system, and that if those two considerations were made, then perhaps the government would take a different view on whether these projects are needed to use water more efficiently or not.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much, Professor Piddock and Colette for coming along to present to us in your comprehensive submission and for taking some questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, committee, for the opportunity to present.
Great, thank you. Ms. Mabry has her hand up. I will come to you in a moment. We're running slightly behind schedule, even though we have had one submitter less this morning. It's the way things go sometimes. I'd still like to take a full 15-minute break so that the committee has time to confer on the issues discussed in preliminary matters this morning. But before we do that, I'll just come to Ms. Mabry for your question.
Thank you, Chair. It was just in relation to that proposal that the committee will consider in the break. If I could make just a couple of very minor points.
Of course, thank you. And I'm happy to hear the views of other parties now before we do break as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I did just want to be clear that 38D of the terms of reference, which the Proponents Council referred to, does relate to considering or seeking the specific views of traditional owners and not sort of impressions of those views or consultation. And I know that there are a number of matters referred to by Proponents Council, but I just did want to ensure that that was clear. Also did want to say that we reject the assertion that people who have made comments have no insight, and that's not something that has been put to submitters for them to address. We also do wonder if the approach proposed will mean that considerable time continues to be taken up in the subsequent ER and EES processes, given the extent to which concerned submitters have raised questions about these matters. But probably most importantly, I did just want to note that Brendan Kennedy did appear before the panel as a traditional owner asserting rights and interests in the area. We appreciate that what might be proposed is to speak in part about specific information relating to other traditional owners, which would not be appropriate for Mr. Kennedy to have access to. But if there is also in that closed session going to be a discussion of general information about traditional owner consultation, we were wondering if the proponent has or the panel will consider the appropriateness of Mr. Kennedy being excluded from that discussion. So they were just the matters we wanted to raise for the committee's consideration. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Mabry. Before you turn your camera off, could I ask you just to expand the point that you were making around future VMFRP matters? Could I just ask you to just elaborate on that?
Yes, I think my point there was just to the extent that any of that closed conversation does not contain confidential information, it likely will inform other parties in this process's understanding of the general approach being taken for all VMFRP projects, and may mean that certain matters that parties have raised concerns with here, parties may consider they're addressed and so do not need to be further elaborated upon in future processes, sort of enabling the more efficient running of the upcoming ER and EES processes, rather than the continued articulation of concerns which people may feel are unaddressed by the information before them.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mabry, for making those points, and it will assist the committee in considering its options. Could I ask if any other party would like to provide any comment before that we do go into the break?
I'd like a short reply to that comment, if I may.
Yes, of course, Mr. Townsend.
First thing, can we clarify whether Environment Victoria is authorised to represent any traditional owners?
I'm happy to, through me, to ask you that question, Ms. Mabry.
In what context?
Are you authorised to represent the interests of any of the traditional owners?
So I think we were clear in our submission yesterday that we were not speaking to the rights of particular traditional owners, but in our original written submission that we filed, we did include comments on behalf of Mr. Kennedy.
So, Member Kendall, this is why these terms of reference include the ability to have private sessions. It is not appropriate for me, I'm representing government agencies, to engage in twos and fro's with other submitters about the reason why we are seeking.
Thank you, Mr. Town. I'm happy to hear the views of other parties while we have this discussion, but I'm also happy for you to provide a response. So, yes.
Well, I want to do it now because in your deliberations, what we are asking you to do is not be informed about our request under clause 42 from parties not representing traditional owners. It's not appropriate. The other thing is you'll hear us in open submission, not in the confidential submission, in open submission for all parties, including Environment Victoria. You'll have our full submissions in our Part C, addressing the terms of reference and how you should apply them. But as we said in opening, one has to be very careful with the submission Environment Victoria just made that might inadvertently elevate that term of reference to some kind of a compulsion. No one in Victoria is compelled to appear at any public process in a planning or environmental inquiry. And it's very important that that term of reference be filtered accordingly. So we will be resisting an interpretation of the term that intrudes upon the rights of people to choose how they wish to participate or not, or engage in a public process. So it has to be interpreted sensitively, not as a demand on anybody. And they're all important matters that we will express openly, not in the confidential submission or the confidential presentation. But the confidential session goes to personal matters and matters of traditional owners that are not represented by others here and ought not be the subject of debate with respect.
Thank you, Mr. Townsend. We understand your position on that. Could I ask if you could just speak briefly to, or what your advice would be to the committee on what it is, would be in a position to do with the information that it does receive through that confidential session?
Well, you're at liberty in the session to then discuss with us what you may wish or not to do further, and to take submissions from us on further information you require, or how you want to raise any other matter with the broader hearing or within it. What I have tried to indicate is that it doesn't mean we're not making submissions on this issue. Our Part C submissions will, in summary, go to the same matters that we will be going to. But as to direct matters, names, feedback, reasons why people have consulted in the way they are, reasons why the consultation encounters sensitivities and is respectful of that, they are totally appropriately dealt with in confidence. And so it's that level of visibility that we'll be able to assist the committee with, but we will also be saying to the committee that it shouldn't be recorded in its report.
Shouldn't be recorded. Thank you. And just, you have covered briefly then what the distinction is and what you're intending to cover in the Part C submission, but just for absolute clarity, could I get you to just recap on what the Part C submission is intended to cover off in relation to the traditional owner issues?
Well, the Part C submission addresses, in general terms, the evaluation objective and takes you back to the specialist assessment and points out the approach it's taken to cultural heritage values, but also in particular the very special relationship consultation has in this part of the world with traditional owner groups. The Part C submission will also include for you an update on consultation in general terms with traditional owners generally through the Mallee CMA, but also on the CHMP. For argument's sake, last week, while the Environment Victoria is making its submissions to you, there were 9 represented traditional owners at the CHMP, a 3-day workshop in Swan Hill. There is a parallel process, and you will be advised about that with further summary and updates. What we're not giving you are details about individuals or groups and what they're saying in there, and also the reasons why, because they are being treated respectfully in an environment of a relationship that is not amenable to a public forum.
Thank you. And my final question before we break is, and I'm not at all suggesting, of course, that any representatives should be compelled to attend, but my question relates to the representation at that proposed closed session and the proponents, the decision, or whether the invitation would be extended to any traditional owners, or what the proponent's intent is in relation to that.
In the public forum, Member Kendall, all I can suggest is you wait for us to address you, and I think the answer to your question will become apparent.
Thank you, Mr.
In the closed session, that is. Yeah.
Okay, I just will ask if any other committee members have questions about the proposal before we do break for our discussion. No, and I don't think no other parties have put their hand up. So on that, we'll break for 15 minutes. Apologies for the submitters who we're running a little bit behind time for. I can see Mr. Kelly is with us and the Murdochs. So I'll ask if they could get presenter status ready for when we return at 12:15. We'll see everybody then. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. Mr. Kelly, I can see that you're with us. I'll come to you in a couple of minutes so that I can see that your camera's working. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Townsend. I'm just waiting for the committee members to join us as well. Apologies for the slight delay in restarting. Committee members may be just logging in again, actually. We'll just wait for a moment till they're here. Thank you. Great, fantastic, thank you. As I mentioned at the beginning of the day, Member Ham was only able to stay with us till around lunchtime or till midday. So he's, whilst it still has his name on the screen, he is actually won't be sitting for the next bit of the session. So thank you, everyone. And again, yes, apologies for running slightly over time in the break there. The committee has had an opportunity in the break to discuss the proposal from the proponent, and we feel that we do need some more information and time to consider the matter, and before we make a decision about how we proceed. We will issue in writing, Mr. Townsend, just some brief dot points to clarify the information that we're seeking. Essentially, obviously the detail of what's being proposed and why, and we ask that when we will circulate our questions as a table document, and we'll ask the proponent to do the same. The response to our questions, given the tight timeline that we're working to now for the finish of the hearing, we would ask that Mr. Townsend be guided by you, actually, if we're able to get questions out to you today. Is it something that you could respond to by Monday, or would you like it to be Tuesday?
Oh no, I'm sorry. Are we talking at the moment about the proposed closed session?
Closed session, that's right. Yeah. Sorry if I didn't make that clear.
No, that's all right. Are the questions in the lead up to responding whether to have a closed session, or are they questions you want to have addressed in a closed session?
So we will just ask the proponent in writing the question, some questions about what exactly is proposed and why. So not the content of the session itself, but more the framing of the session and the mechanisms and the intent. And then obviously if the session is held, that will be a separate process. So the initial response is really just a written explanation to be circulated to all parties and to give the committee some time to consider some of the different elements of it.
I can take that as a question now, if you like, and we can email.
We felt like we needed a little bit more time, actually, to make sure that we considered all of the aspects. So we'll circulate something in writing this afternoon.
We'll respond ASAP when we get that, because we are keen to assist you within the time available, and unless we're taken by surprise in those questions, I can't imagine it will take us long to reply.
Okay, that would be fantastic. Thank you. And then we can make a decision, and we'll respond quickly as well to as to what our decision is in relation to that. Thank you very much. Great. So we will move back into submissions, and Mr. Kelly, as I mentioned, I can see you on the screen, so welcome. If you would like to unmute yourself, I will happy to hand directly to you to commence your submission. And if you could just leave a few minutes at the end for committee questions. So we've got a time allocation of 20 minutes for you.
Okay. Hi, Member Kendall, and just an audio visual check. You mind coming through visually and audibly?
Yes, I can see you clearly and hear you clearly. And I understand you do have a presentation.
So is that clear?
I can't see anything if you've shared your screen. So just using the share screen function, I think you should have access to that. It's a little, should be the little green button arrow down the bottom. There we go. Thank you. So that's showing it, but not yet full screen. Or not, yes, great.
Okay.
Yes, great. Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
I'm not sure if it'll glitch on this computer. It's coming up with a flat battery message, but it's 100%, so it's just a glitch. I should be right to keep going. Just a thank you and why we need these works. You've heard a lot of reasons why we haven't. The proponents put some great messages forward. I just wanted to go through some of those, and particularly just wanted to congratulate the proponent and partners and all the others presenting on the wonderful job that's been done. Thoroughly enjoyed the quality and standard and the presentations maintained through the last 2 weeks. Just a couple of acknowledgements from our traditional owners and also some of the other information I've used in the presentation. So who am I? Peter Kelly, owner-operator, Murray Off-Road Adventures. You can see there, my lovely wife helps me out there. We've been doing that since 2017. Part of our objective is to be able to present these landscapes that we've been talking about, right from the South Australian border up through to Swan Hill and all the Victorian, New South Wales parts adjoining. It's all in a semi-arid landscape, and some of the presentations, I think people have forgotten that the variability just from Echuca through to the South Australian border is nearly 200 millimetres difference in rainfall, and these semi-arid landscapes really rely on these valuable flows that are coming through, and exactly like the one we just saw in the last few months. In our travels, we explore strong connections with water and the land, and not only the fresh water, but the salt lakes and billabongs and creeks, everything you've heard about again. We discuss the significance and the powerful impact of the Murray River in our region in its many forms. This is presented in an educational and entertaining manner. Just some of our street cred. Murray Off-Road Adventures, only been operating for 5 years, and just before COVID we were the gold winners for the RACV Tourism Awards, and been able to really enjoy that part of being able to circulate in the broader spectrum, and that allows us to market internationally as well. My background, I absolutely know these projects in and out. I started work in government departments back in 1983, and as I said, retired from government departments in 2017 and took up the works. In that time, I've been involved with developing and implementing numerous plans from state, federal and local levels, the Malik public and private lands. This includes engaging and working with a broad range of community, and you don't have to be told how broad and large that range is from the last few days. Since 2004, I've had direct involvement with artificial watering of floodplains, and I get frustrated listening to some of these presentations where they talk about the simplicity of doing these things. These projects have been underway through the CMA and DELP and other beneficiaries of these works way back since that early mid-2000s, when trial works and that was started and to be developed, and then water management plans were being developed to actually allow for the setup of these projects. They weren't just artificially plucked out of the air as 3 sites. There's a whole process that went right through for the state of Victoria to look at these, and the Mallee Waterway Strategy and other CMA Mallee documents really provide all the background and that Mr. Pittock was saying was missing. It's there, but it's in background information, and I encourage the panel to seek more information on that. But there is a huge amount of engagement and process that's gone on and I was directly involved with as a Mallee Waterway manager through a lot of that. With all the plans developed, consultants I've worked with, I considered myself to have very good understanding of these Mallee landscapes, and a deep passion allows me to be able to sell these products and that as a tourist part of our natural landscapes of these areas. So the solution, with a touch of sarcasm, remove all the large structures, everything. Stop water extraction, remove all the locks and weirs. These proposed floodplain works will not be required. But the dilemma, you've heard it all, it's been presented in several different forms, both positive and negative, but these are the key issues. We've got large storages that stop us getting the flows and getting everything down there at the right time. Or we can use these projects will ensure that the health of our floodplains at a worst is maintained and best improved. My problem I keep hearing with all the negative options is if we don't start doing something now, these flows can't be created bigger than 60 to 70,000. So we're not actually getting the site at Hatta. It just doesn't get touched at that, even what the best that was being proposed. So these works and the current floods, we really need these works to make it happen. And there's great sites that have been demonstrated. Mulcra Island, out between Lindsay and Walpolar Island, the Hatta Lakes, it is a very good example. I take my customers there all the time and they just actually love it. Being able to see big red gum trees, full flush before this flood, and also over in South Australia, talk about the salt impacts over in South Australia, but nothing was mentioned about the benefits that's come from the Chewilla TLM project and the environmental values right through that system. So all I've been receiving dedicated watering regimes as far back as 2004, Mulcra Island and Chowla, through to 2010. The other one I didn't mention before is Bottle Bend. I'm currently involved with that on the New South Wales side. All have infrastructure similar to the EES proposed projects. And, these are some of the things, if you ever do get a chance to the field trip, I know it's been blocked off at this stage, but if you do get a chance to get out and have a look at some of these, because these landscapes, you can't help but drive through them and see the difference. We visit these sites regularly when it's not flooded or we've got COVID, and our customers are always impressed. So an example of the presentation, and I'm not trying to tell you to suck eggs or anything, but I'm just trying to give you a snapshot of some of those things that we like to be able to show to our customers as we drive through, so they understand where things are, what the issues are, why we've got irrigation and that in some areas and not others, but in particular, just these natural landscapes and the challenges that broader settlement has. We also, this is an image of Southeast Australia. You can see Chowla there. Mildura is close to that number 5 dot in the middle. And this image is part of the Jimbola works. You can see the old shorelines of Australia and those lines going around through there. And this is the full extent. So I'll just do a few quick slides that'll help you be able to understand some of this. So that's the full extent. We've got the Flinders Ranges to the top left and the Grampians as part of the Great Dividing Range connection right through there. And then as we go through the years, the water receded and these old shorelines stay as main features in the landscape where we actually get salt and that coming back out through into the waterways. We're down to 4 million years ago and the ridge comes right at the South Australian border while we've got the big high cliffs and that through that area. And then the next phase is Lake Bungunya. So we've gone from saline into freshwater, and in that freshwater we've started to create a new landscape for us to consider today. The next one, some of the other key influences for us is the transect or the fault lines that look like transect lines in these areas. The Danio fault Hammersley Fault. Daniel is still quite active. Only 18 months ago, it was 4.5 on the Richter scale, and no one in the Mallee even knew until we heard it on the news. Lake Tyrrell over to the other side. So you've now got a layer of clay over the top of that salt, and these are the values that allow for a far more agricultural system that and the natural landscapes that have evolved over time since then. 60,000 years ago, we've got a wet regime. The Murray Rivers started flowing back out to the ocean. We've got clay on top of the salt, but there's those interconnections where it cuts through. We're starting to have some issues. We then continue on to around 20,000 years ago. That 60,000 years ago, you can also note that was quite significant with, this is why it would have been very suitable for Aboriginal communities and that to be living in these landscapes. Around 20,000 years ago, dry glacial shadow, and it starts to dry out and we start getting windblown sands to give us the top surface we have now. It may be a simplistic way, but what I'm trying to do is give you that build up over time and then what the things are that allow us to be here, the values we enjoy, and what allows for horticulture to be able to undertake in these areas. We've also got this 1788 as a critical area, and we really enjoy working with the Aboriginal communities to do our presentations, that much so that Warren Clark, one of the elders from the Barkindji, is one of our drivers when we are doing certain tours and that, and totally up to date with concerns and issues and that around that point of view. And you've definitely had those discussions already, and it is an ongoing management issue, and it's been around for a while, and I really commend the CMA on the way they've been working with Indigenous people over the last 15 to 20 years to work through these on-ground issues. Just some of the other early contacts. So Charles Sturt coming through in 1830, and that was really getting to know. That was a positive engagement. So from around 38 and that, Edward John Eyre was coming through, and grazing licenses and tour routes and that to Adelaide and Sydney for stock were starting to evolve, and we're looking at that as quite a negative phase where there was lots of negative interactions and that way to massacres and other areas. The next real positive one, other than the individual grazing officers, was Dr. Willem Blandowski, and just that figure in 1857 where he set base just downstream of these sites at Merbeen. Over 17,000 plant and animal specimens collected, and all collected by the local Indigenous community. So we forget to look at the positives that have happened there. There's a lot of negatives, but it's wonderful to be able to see some of those collections and the story that went with that. Just the acknowledgement of those groups, and as I said, it's not an easy, straightforward process, and to avoid some of that confusion, just some of the groups that are in this area, the Latchi, the Neri Neri, Wagaya, Tati Tati, Nintate, and other groups. There's twos and fros within those groups. I've listed some of those, some aren't relevant at the moment, but we as a tourist operator need to be acknowledging of all of those, like on the New South Wales side with the Karinji and the Barkindji. Just a quick snapshot of that Blandowski and his mate Gerald Kraft to the side. First selfie I've acknowledged around in these areas, but you can see Latchi, Neri Neri community and some of the specimens just there on the bottom of the picture. That's a Murray Cray. They don't actually live in these areas, so managing our waterways to improve it back up around Hatter and Belser Island where they are at the moment, but at Mildura that just the river regulation has prevented them from persisting. Just some of the things on our landscape today. The forgotten story, it's been mentioned a couple of times about salinity, but this really demonstrates out of the Mallee CMA catchment strategy draft consultation. This diagram on our left, we're looking at 1992 when there was a basin salinity management strategy developed and implemented. And you can see when the 3 states and everyone works together, these are the different sites. The purple is Swan Hill, the orange, Robinvale area, the green, Mildura, and the blue, the South Australian border. And that allows a really good trend of downward, even when you had the big years of 2011-12. There was slight spikes, but continued to trend down, and it'll be interesting with this year's big flood to see how that goes again. As I said, the big old red gums, I'm not going to go into the detail like some of the people have. It's really about these landscapes, enjoying them. There's not only the values for Indigenous communities right along the whole Murray area through these areas. People love to camp and use the big sandbars. It's a passion that people will continue to be drawn to these areas, and the Murray River being just a narrow channel, it's already started to be able to allow access again. Some of the areas of Kings Billabong and Bottle Bend on the New South Wales Hatter is still quite restricted, but we're starting to be able to get back into some of those areas, and it looks magnificent. The tree canopies are just so lush. Also influencing again, just ever so close, this is just west of Hatter, the Rock Plain. It's all a lower area, and salt actually drains out from the river to these areas. This area is about 29 to 30 metres above sea level, and 40 kilometres back to your east, there's the Hatter Lakes, and so there's as much water feeding from the river back out. So this is one of those areas where salt was never a major issue until you get to the north end where we're talking about with this project. But the main lakes and that salt, it's all about fresh water through there. Some of the landscape changes, you know, right throughout time, there's always a new face to look at, even if people come back a time again. My wife and I, when we're out and about, it's always a pleasure to be able to see how these landscapes are different each time, but also still in reasonable nick. And as I said, Mulcra Island and Hatter Lakes are our 2 favourite requested sites, not because we promote them, it's because that's what people want to see. And when they see it, they're providing really good responses back. And the Hatter Lakes, the Ramsar part of it is absolutely looking magnificent before this flood, and I can't wait to see it just after the flood. You know, and the flora and fauna, we've talked about all the little butterflies and everything, but we've still got all these other species and that need to be taken into account. It's not just the rare and threatened. We've got as land managers and waterway managers and community, we need to look across and protect the whole broad spectrum. You know, we can't just focus on one aspect. So I really encourage you to continue to think about the broader aspect of these projects as well. And then from our point of view as tourism operators, tourism brings in 308 million in our region. That's from the Mildura Rural City Council, December 2020. And the Murray River is so much part of it, from our paddle boats, for our houseboats, all of those components, just the fishing, the general recreational side of it, people coming up from many years to around Belser Island and into Hatter to have their annual pilgrimage from areas as far away as Ballarat and right down near the coast. So that's really it, and I'll hand back to you, Member Kendall, for any further instruction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly, and thank you for taking the time to prepare an interesting presentation. Your tour operator experience is evident. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for coming along and taking the time to present to us. I don't have any particular questions, but you've put your position very clearly. Thank you.
Yes.
So I'll ask the Murdochs if they could please now pop their camera. Not sure if you're sitting together or separately. Great. Dr. Murdoch is with us. Is it just you presenting to us today?
It is, Chair Kendall. I'm actually presenting from the Alfred Hospital, so my husband's an apology today.
Thank you very much and apologies for running slightly behind time. We appreciate hearing from you. So I'll hand directly to you to commence.
Okay. Sorry, I'm also under duress with only a single screen, so please let me know when you have presentation mode.
It's all clear, thank you.
Thank you. So I will start by, apologising for my husband. My name's Fiona Murdoch. I have been managing a conservation property called Rakagillum since 2001 with my husband Phil. I have 24 years experience in natural resource management in the Mallee of Northwest Victoria, and Phil has over 40 years experience managing national and state parks, including a few years as ranger in charge of Hattah National Park. I will acknowledge the traditional owners, being the Latchi people of the land which Rakagillum is on, and acknowledge their deep connection to land, water and community, and elders past and present. Today, I'll run through a quick introduction to the property and touch on the 2022 flood, with the main purpose of allowing the committee to ask any questions around the flooding of Rakagillum Creek. I'll also touch on our experience with landholder consultation through the Hattah North component of this project. I'll talk about monitoring and mitigation activities for Rakagillum, and talk about the deed of agreement, which is referred to as landholder agreements in the EES LU2. So this is Rakagillum outlined in red from the northern edge of Hattah National Park. Have a park on 3 sides of us with irrigated horticulture to the north. So you can see in the west of the property that approximately 40 hectares is proposed to be inundated as part of the Lake Bulka inundation area. This is just an aerial photograph of the property. You can see that Rakagillum Creek comes in off the Chalker Creek, which is an anna branch of the Murray River. Rakagillum Creek flows out to the dry lakes. It actually flows both ways. So on a high river, the water will flow from east to west. And then when the river drops away, the floodwaters will move from west to east and discharge out to the Murray River. When we purchased the property, there are 5 artificial blockages already in the creek. We removed a few of those, 2 of the most important ones. However, the very large boomerang-shaped levee that's closest to the Chalker Creek in the northeast is not on our property, so we have no influence over that levee. The other important levee is in the west of the property, which we retained under some advice in 2007 that it may be required for environmental watering purposes. So as I've previously explained via email, the boomerang-shaped levee did fail in the 2022 flood, and that allowed water to move into Rakagillum Creek, where it was held up against the power line levee. At the same time, the Bitterang levee overtopped from the south, and water moved from south to north through the area. When the water reached our property on the 15th of December, we breached the power line levee, and that resulted in the inundation of the dry lake system. The reason we breached the levee at that time was to allow water to discharge off the floodplain as the flood receded. And that's what is and what was happening. So I'll move on to our experiences with the project to date. We have been quite disappointed with the level of engagement that we've experienced as affected landholders. We found it to be quite superficial and very much at the informed level, and that was probably exacerbated by us waiting for this landholder agreement that we heard a lot about. When the landholder agreement arrived, it was nothing like we thought it was. So I admit we probably missed a few opportunities to talk in detail. And that's one of the reasons why. I will talk a little bit about restoration ecology, because that's my field. And I just really wanted to emphasise that ecological restoration is about making values-based judgments. So if you're trying to do this, you really need to make sure that you're working to shared values, and you need to move from just presenting the science to using the best available knowledge. So that includes talking with traditional knowledge holders and also local knowledge. So that was something we really found was missing from the process. We had very much a presentation of the science, this is what's going to happen, and it wasn't so much that working towards the shared values. So what are our values? This is Racagellum back in 2006, and we identified that the very brittle landscape in the semi-arid area, the greatest threat is overgrazing. So for us, we really value understory diversity and cover, and particularly palatable species in the understory, and also soil health. So we really focus on managing grazing pressure really intensively on Racagellum. So that's grazing pressure from feral pigs, goats, and total grazing pressure. So it includes overabundant kangaroos, which are all the black splodges you can see in the photograph is kangaroo poo. We've been pretty successful to date. So this is our floodplain. You can see it's very much a chenopod, so a salt bush and grassy understory. And we have achieved really good cover. The property also has ephemeral wetlands, and these are basically flooded on high rainfall events. So they're very short-lived. But as you can see from the photo of the 26th of December, the property has been flooded for the first time in 50 years, but there is a proposed inundation frequency of 1 year in every 10. So naturally, we really wanted to understand how the project would interact with the work we've been doing on Racagellum, and how we can achieve shared benefits from the project. In the absence of a site visit, I've just popped in some plant photos that you might enjoy. So all these endangered species occur on the Racagellum floodplain. So it's really important for us to understand the frequency, extent, depth, duration, and timing of proposed inundation. I'm very much a details person, and I do agree with Mr. Frood that the riverine chenopod woodland, which is on our property, exists in 2 states with a gradient in between. So you've got the more regularly flooded area, which has a lignum and a goosefoot understory, and we don't have very much of that at all. But we have the higher floodplain component of it, where it's a really diverse saltbush, grassy, forb understory. And that responds really well to shallow inundation following rainfall events, but we're a bit concerned about the proposed project's frequency of 1 year in 10. So it's really, really important for us to understand how that will affect the species that we manage for on the property. So this is Lepidium monoplacoides. It was a bit of a short-lived excitement for us. It was found on the property in September by some really awesome volunteer wetland ecologists, but very shortly after it was flooded. So on the left you can see the before shot and then the after shot of where the Lepidium occurs. We do share the concerns of Mr. Frood that artificially holding water on the floodplain for too long is a problem. So in this area where the Lepidium occurs, although it was flooded, the duration of the flood was quite short because that power line levee had been breached and the water flowed off this area reasonably quickly. It's not dry by any means, but it's certainly not being held back by that levee, which holds back a depth of around 2.5 metres of water. So throughout the consultation process, we found it really difficult to get the information that we were asking for. So this is actually table document 68, and it's still the best map I've actually seen about the inundation extent on our property. it does show two areas of concern for us that highlights to us that perhaps the model is a bit out of date and might need a bit of a refresh. It will be too hard to see on the screen, but I'll try with my cursor. This is the location of the power line levee, which we were advised is out of scope of the project because the area of inundation here wouldn't reach it, which we know from on the ground reality, there is absolutely no way the water would get to that point without hitting the power line levee. This is the levee in question. And the other area of concern for us, I'm assuming you can see my cursor, Chair. Could you nod if you can? Yeah, thank you. The other area of concern for us is here. And we know from our experience on the property that this entire basin fills up before the water moves west over the Momple track and out to the dry lake system. So to have this very small area of inundation is, in our mind, inaccurate. And it's really important for us to have this detailed information. We have visitor infrastructure in the way of a walking track. We do revegetation projects. We need to have the best available information. This is Acacia oswaldii, one of the flood sensitive species. It can survive inundation to a shallow depth. So both of these plants have been inundated for the same period. The difference is the depth of inundation. The plant on the left, deeply inundated, died. Plant on the right survives. So the proposed monitoring and mitigation measures for Racagellum as private property, we understand from correspondence from the proponent that there will be no monitoring or mitigation on private land. We were very, very keen to have some property scale baseline and ongoing monitoring so that we can make informed decisions about future watering events. And we're very happy to have a collaborative approach. I was very pleased to see that the committee had requested the MER framework because that's a document I've been asking for quite some months to understand what exactly the monitoring that was being proposed was going to be, because there's obviously some elements that we can do quite easily. So we could take on the bird and frog monitoring quite easily with some assistance around the flora monitoring. We also think that this sort of thing would actually be useful because we manage grazing pressures so intensively on the property. It would provide useful information about that interaction between flood responsive vegetation and increased grazing pressure that you get after a watering event. We were also very keen to pursue understanding of, if we do see some disbenefits of environmental watering observed, what do we do about it? How can we manage that? And unfortunately, it does seem that the pest, plant and animal plan and all those sorts of things doesn't apply to private land, which I think is a missed opportunity to really maximise the benefits of environmental water in that broader landscape. So we've already seen a massive increase in noisy miners. It's a threatening process. Those birds impact on the mallee bird community. They're very aggressive and they respond to that environment that's created by environmental watering. So very healthy tree canopy with a lot of flowers and reduced understory due to the watering killing the understory shrubs. We're also, look, I've got to say, we're actually a bit scared about the burden of weed control that's going to come after this flood and after subsequent watering events. This is Phil with welding gloves on, weeding Bathurst burr, and like the picture on the left, that's a Nagura burr that's come in on the floodwater. They're already germinating. So there are requirements on us to manage weeds under the Kelp Act. They're negligible requirements. You really need to do a lot more specific weed control than legislative obligations in order to achieve the benefits that environmental water can deliver. Other issue I've talked about is pigs. to my mind, it's a real shame to just deliver water and then not follow up with complementary measures such as pig control. So we've just spent $11,000 on thermal imaging and hundreds of hours to try and control the pigs that are currently on Rakajilum. And the reason for that is the electric fence we have around the property obviously can't work when the fence is flooded. So it's been off since October. And finally, I'll talk about the great disappointment, the deed of agreement or the landholder agreements. We really hope to have meaningful involvement in the decision making for watering on the property. So the proponent has advised that we can participate through the EWOMP and the seasonal watering plan. But when we actually receive the deed of agreement, it does take away any ability for us to negotiate, or so it would really be only involvement at the informed level, because it would be being advised about what watering regime had been decided was appropriate for our property. I thought it was quite interesting that the proponent advised that temporary agreements were available, and that was technical note 5 where I read that, and that certainly has never been discussed with us. We also received a property management plan, which I'm still unclear of the purpose of it. It seems to, it certainly wasn't what we expected. However, we did anticipate that it would be a useful document for future management of the property. So the property has a conservation covenant on it and administered by Trust for Nature. As part of that covenant, there is a property management plan which advises future landholders how to manage the property. So the conservation properties are at greatest risk when they change hands. So it's really important that that property management plan can accurately describe what goes on the property, so that you can mitigate that risk and the next landholder can manage the property equally well. So I'll just very quickly, I just really encourage the VMFRP team to meaningfully engage with local landholders and be flexible in their approach, acknowledge risk and uncertainty, and continue to be flexible and engaging if the projects do proceed. We really need to maximise the benefits of environmental watering, and to do that we need to ensure that all land tenures are adequately monitored and managed before, during and after the watering. And that's all I had to present. So I'll stop sharing and I'm happy to respond to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maddock. We'll probably just have a few questions for you. And I might start with just a couple of clarification. The last point, or the second last point you were making about the property management plan, just wasn't 100% clear of the actual, what you were trying to convey or what you're intending to convey with that point.
Yes, so I had hoped to work with the VMFRP team to build a document about environmental watering that could then be appended to our Trust for Nature property management plan to form a useful package for future landholders, so they fully understood why the watering was occurring if the project proceeds, what risks there are, what benefits they are, and what their responsibility as future managers of that private land would be. And it didn't turn out that way.
Okay, thank you. No, that's clear. And my second question relates to the modelling image that you showed us, where you were explaining that there were areas of your property that you were confident would be inundated and didn't match the modelling. I'm just wanting to understand what you see as the implications of that on your property, and whether it is more of an issue on a private property, or do you see it more broadly as an issue?
I see it more broadly as an issue for the project, because there are no blockages in Rakajilum Creek anymore, so it will flood from the Murray at lower flows of the Murray. But the other thing is when the environmental water is delivered over the Bitarang through the Bitarang regulator, it may discharge out Rakajilum Creek instead of taking that route out to the dry lakes. So,
okay, sorry, just to confirm, that was in relation to the flood, what you were, I had identified as inaccuracies in the flood modelling, is that correct?
yeah, so the flood monitoring didn't consider...
Not monitoring, sorry, the model itself, yes, yeah.
Yeah, so the flood modelling didn't consider that levy in the Rakajilum Creek was important to the project. However, we believe it was important, and now it's not there, and we think that has implications.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's clear.
The other concern we have is if there is an extent of inundation which is greater than the model predicts, which we suspect is the case, it might lead us to, and that's very much our private land problem, it might lead us to do inappropriate revegetation in some areas and things like that.
Thank you. So I'll ask, I think Member Bell has a few questions for you. I'll hand over to her. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good, thanks. So you've mentioned in your presentation that your understanding is that the EMF would not apply to private land. The EMF has a number of monitoring aspects during operations, for example, surface water, groundwater. You touched on the pest, plant and animals. Are those general monitoring requirements the types of things you would like included either in an individual work agreement that could be agreed through the landowner agreement or through the EMF applying to private land as well?
Yes, so certainly the things that are proposed in the MER framework are suitable ways of monitoring the project. And yeah, it's definitely our hope that that sort of monitoring could be conducted on our property.
Sorry, you've mentioned there the MER framework. I was specifically referring to the EMF framework, which has some different monitoring requirements, perhaps not as involved as the MER.
So I think we're very comfortable with what's proposed for groundwater and surface monitoring. That's a more broader issue for the project. So there's sort of nothing specifically there. Same things with sort of the erosion, the soil, those sorts of elements. We're all very comfortable with that. It really is just the flora and fauna response and complementary measures around pest, plant and animal control. That's our concerns.
Thank you. Thank you. And so you mentioned you're looking to cooperate. So are you looking specifically for funding or to allow external parties on the site to do so, or are you open to all those sorts of arrangements being discussed and agreed to?
I think we've always managed the property collaboratively with adjoining parks and through the Mallee CMA, so we would intend to do that. I think it's the primary concern for us is our ability to be involved in decision making about the watering regime on the property. So that's our primary area where we're concerned about the deed of agreement, taking away that ability. And then the secondary concern is we also need additional monitoring in place in order for us to assist with informed decision making regarding the property.
Thank you. When you previously spoke to us, you had some specific recommendations regarding the butterfly. Are you submitting such items would be included in a property specific management plan or across the project?
I think the Agaris butterfly needs to be managed throughout its range. It's certainly not, as R8 have indicated, it's certainly not solely on Racagillum. So Racagillum could form a component of the monitoring for the butterfly. However, it shouldn't be exclusively monitored on private land.
Thank you. And would you propose those be standalone EDS measures or a specific management plan for the butterfly?
I think we have a flora and fauna management plan proposed as part of the construction phase. I think that may be a useful thing to have as part of the operation phase as well.
Thank you. And for the operations, would you see that as being limited to the butterfly or more broader than that?
I can only speak for the butterfly in terms of flora on our property. Yeah, it's possibly not required with the possible exception of the Lepidium monoplacoides. But yeah, I can't speak for other fauna more broadly beyond our property.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Member Bell.
Thank you very much, Dr. Murdoch, for coming along and presenting to the committee again. We really appreciate hearing from you under challenging circumstances by the look at, so we really appreciate that and I hope things go well for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our final submitter is Peter Thornton. So thank you very much for joining us. I can see that you have your camera on successfully. It's wonderful. And I'm happy to hand directly to you to commence your submissions. And Ms. Thornton, I had you down for an approximately 30-minute time slot. Is that what you're anticipating? Oh, I can't hear you actually. I can see that your mute button is off, but I can't hear you speaking. Do you have a headset or anything that you could try plugging in? Looks like Ms. Thornton's having a few issues getting their sound working. We might just rise for a few minutes while she sorts that out. So we'll come back in about, it's 12 past, we'll come back at 15:15 and hopefully she'll be right by then. Thank you.
Firstly, it has actually let me unmute myself, which is a start. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Waiting back. Welcome back. Great, thank you. And I can see a different name on your screen, but I understand that's you with us, Ms. Thornton.
That's me, yes. So I'm horrified to think that I've just kept all you people waiting like that. I had no idea that I'd actually logged in via my browser rather than via my account, and I think that that's why that it wouldn't let my audio go.
No problems at all. Just take a deep breath and take your time.
Yeah, well, I was trying to say that I hope I don't take half an hour. I certainly don't have half an hour of material prepared as such. I had ticked the box to present, back when I made my submission, which was brief in its own right. Currently I'm occupied growing stone fruit. That's what I do for a living now, and we're in our harvest time. So it's been 7 days a week for the last 3 months kind of thing, all during this process. So I feel really unprepared, to be honest, and I haven't had a chance to look at all the documentation that's been put up by the proponent. So I guess I can talk more generally, and in my submission I did just sort of add a previous submission that I'd made because I didn't have the time to really make it up. Anyway, so yeah, I'll just start by introducing myself. I've lived all of my life in either Naya, Swan Hill, or now Warraneen, which is in northern Victoria on the Murray River. Apart from when I went to Melbourne to study university, I came home after that to work in natural resource management, various different roles with non-government organisations, mainly in conservation on private land is probably a lot of the work that I did during that time. Then I also ran a business propagating native and indigenous plants, sort of a wholesale revegetation nursery for a period of 7 or 8 years. And then I became full-time employed on on mine and my husband's family farm, where we grow stone fruit. And that sort of swallowed me up, so to speak. Yeah, but it's also given me great insight to the basin plan from an irrigator's perspective and water reform more generally. Yeah, so I had insights sort of on both sides, but I'm very much a nature conservationist. I've spent a lot of time in engaging with the basin plan since the beginning of the water reform process, and so I'm very interested and I care deeply about the river system, so I guess that's why I'm here. I certainly consider myself to be a supporter of the basin plan and water reform as such, or the idea that we are trying to rebalance consumptive use and water for the river. However, I guess my trust has been eroded considerably since the beginning of the basin plan, mainly due to political will and the lack of the full implementation of the basin plan. I guess to me, my observation is that it's only been partially implemented. We've recovered some water, that's useful, but we haven't meaningfully tried to implement the 450 gigalitres or the constraints relaxation projects, which go hand in hand with the water that's recovered. And I very much see that these SDL adjustment projects should be the last part of the plan, and hence I see them as very much premature, risky, very expensive, and very much premature if they actually ever end up being implemented, which I'm sure that they probably will. I'll go back to my submission just to sort of try and bring myself back to some of the main points that I wanted to make. I do believe that the main thing that we can do is restore integrity and restore trust, because I think at all spectrums of our community have the trust has been eroded in terms of our governments, our belief that agencies and government will be able to act in the whole community's best interests. And so how do we do that? We have to put our faith and fully act by the law. And I was really concerned that the Murray-Darling Basin Royal Commission was largely ignored, and the fact that they found that it's quite possible that the SDL figure was unlawful, and that therefore any adjustment to that SDL figure could also be unlawful. That was a great concern to me, and we've just kept moving forward, and we haven't listened to those recommendations that came out of the SA Royal Commission. That's a problem. The Productivity Commission had major concerns with these projects. They suggested that they were risky and expensive, and suggested independent gateway review processes for them, which never happened. So there's all these things that have happened, yet we keep pushing forward. Those things, when we hear these things, whether it be through the Royal Commission or through reports, through assessments, and those recommendations are not implemented, that means that, you know, we don't trust the system. And hence then there's been the review of the EPBC Act, which had some pretty scary findings. So again, we're out here in the community. We want to believe that we can make good on this massive reform that we've undertaken, and it was bold, it was brave, it was courageous to think that we could you know, make our water use in the basin more sustainable. But have we done that? I don't think that we have. My next question is, have we got enough actual environmental water recovered? My large problem with this project and all of the other supply measure projects is that they, you know, they justify the offset of water recovery. And given that climate change has reduced inflows considerably and eroded the entitlements that have been held, is it wise that we are now justifying quite a huge reduction in water to be recovered by these experimental projects? I think that observed flows and also long-term annual average yield of the entitlements would be a better guide to where we are, where we need to be in terms of water recovery. And the other major problem that I have is that because there is so little progress being made on constraints relaxation projects within the basin, we have no idea what we can actually do with the water that we've recovered. We've done all this amazing work getting the water, the environmental water, but we're not being able to make the most of it if we don't implement the plan fully and actually do these constraints relaxation projects. And out here in the community, honestly, we're just at the beginning of having a proper go at that. On both sides of the river here in our community, there are conversations being had and moves by both state governments at different levels, but that people are starting to understand what constraints relaxation is all about, and that it is going to be a win-win for our community. But most of all, we've done all this work to recover the water. If we can't restore the flows by relaxing constraints, you know, it's a huge amount of wasted effort and wasted taxpayer money to have the water sitting in the dam and not being able to get it out into all of the reaches of our basin. And we certainly haven't seen environmental water being used in our region to great benefit. I'll just say a few quick, brief statements about I'll just quickly have a quick look. Yeah, so I guess that little ramble was about, do we even know if we have enough environmental water recovered? We're reducing it in a big way with these projects, but we really don't know whether that's a justified thing or not. The other thing is that it's a numbers game, and the numbers are very unclear at this stage. For example, we have inconsistent metering across the whole basin. We in the southern basin and in where I irrigate from, which is in part of the Golden Murray Water Irrigation District, is very different in terms of the metering in the northern basin. We've got the huge expansion of irrigation in various parts of the basin, including all the floodplain harvesting that's been quite controversial and has expanded to in great numbers. Climate change, it's just how anyone can honestly say that they understand that these numbers are justified and that the offsets are justified. It's quite bold, I think, for governments to be doing that, and I would caution that it is extremely risky and probably not in the best use of taxpayer dollars. I want to also just say a few things about economics, because clearly central to this reform and these projects, socioeconomic impact has justified the major offsets to water recovery, and it's been majorly weaponised during the implementation of the Basin Plan. We've had governments, the media and various vested interests have had the tendency to pick and choose and commission reports to tell a particular story, but there are plenty of reports that detail our resilience during these major reforms as well. I've observed in my community general economic prosperity. Irrigated agriculture has seen massive expansion, including in our municipality, and during the phase of water recovery and climate change impacts. It was always going to allow for water to move from one area to the other when we unbundled and marketised water. So there was always going to be a level of impact or a moving from one geographical location to another. But irrigation communities have also gained a huge amount from the water reform in terms of investment in infrastructure. Last year, $350 million was given to irrigators in the Gold Murray Water Irrigation District, just given back to irrigators. So we as irrigators have had a lot of help along the way with this reform, and there seems to have been where we've been very, very hasty to not undertake the full water recovery that science has told us is necessary for a healthy basin. And it's all been based on economic figures that I just don't see on the ground here out in our communities. Businesses like mine, we've moved more towards an entitlement and allocation mix to grow our crops. For example, we only own about half the water we need to grow our crop each year. And we've moved past the point of starting to understand how to operate in this new system of the water market, and we're really moving into that phase where we're those that are still here are thriving, and we understand the system so much better than perhaps we did even 2 and 3 years ago. Export has improved things for so many irrigation communities and industries like grapes, citrus, stone fruit, which is what I grow. Our exporter said the change in Mildura, he said he'd never seen anything like it. I mean, I don't know a farmer that doesn't drive a vehicle that's worth less than $100,000. Most farmers in my region here that I know of, and I know all my neighbours, they all drive either European cars. There's a Porsche down the road, for goodness sakes. We are doing very well, and we own profitable businesses. Farms are selling at record prices. People are wanting to invest in agriculture. So to make out that irrigated agriculture has fallen into a major slump because of the Basin Plan, I think is ill-informed. And I do refer to Sarah Wheeler, her comments that Jamie Pittock and Matt Coloff put up. I think that's really important to that the committee acknowledge her work and have a look further at the report. Swan Hill Rural City Council commissioned their own report to prove how valuable irrigated agriculture was to their municipality, and it had grown considerably in the period of this water reform. And none of the reports indicate or count the cost of the full basin plan implementation as opposed to the modified basin plan implementation. And they don't count the costs. It's impossible to count the costs of what might have been had we not implemented the basin plan. So really all we've got to do is follow the law. And at the moment, the law allows us, we could, for example, enact some sort of hierarchy where, we make sure that we implement the full basin plan before we undertake these hugely expensive engineering projects that are risky, that cause a lot of harm to the environment as well, so that we know that they actually are required to keep some of these places alive. Very, very briefly, what we've observed during the period of the implementation of the basin plan in our little region is that in the late 70s, 80s and early 90s, we observed regular overbank flooding of our floodplain forests, lakes, etc. And we a really healthy and diverse sort of floodplain ecosystem. It was really quite wonderful when you look back at it. And it really wasn't that long ago either. As I say, it was up to the mid-90s, just prior to the Millennium Drought. Through the Millennium Drought and to now, we've really not seen any major improvements. We've got all this water recovered, but we're not seeing it out in the ground in our region, mainly because we haven't relaxed the constraints. We're not able to get the flows below Yarrawonga and below Turrumbary back to what they were back in that 80s and 90s phase, which to me is what we should be aiming for. So what we've seen is desiccation of our floodplains. We've seen no overbank flooding. We've seen a little bit of pumping of environmental water into a few different sites. We observe that a lot of our floodplains and billabongs are filling up with trees and changing the ecosystem considerably, creating really the changes are out there. They're happening already because of the way the system's being managed at the moment. The weeds are exacerbated because there's been very little flooding. So we really haven't seen a major improve since the MDP plan has recovered the water. And I really feel that investing all of this money in these hugely expensive projects is premature, as I said previously, until you relax the constraints, which is part of the basin plan, to see what we can really do with the water we already have recovered. I don't see it as being an effective and efficient use of government spending to spend all this money to flood ecosystems that can already flood their floodplains. All you have to do is get the water up. And we see in our region, because of the expansion of irrigation in the Lower Murray, flows regularly get up just below the height needed to flow into our floodplains. And so by piggybacking environmental water into these areas, we really can do a huge amount and get a lot of water out onto the floodplain if we were to relax constraints. So I really believe that that's where we should be placing our efforts, rather than risking all of the unknowns with these expensive projects. Just lastly, I'll sum up now. With just going over the ecological risks that I see with these projects. I don't see these projects as ecological restoration, that the ecological restoration that they've been painted with. I'd say they've been marketed as ecological restoration, whereas I see them more as justification to reduce the water recovery target. We've, right from the word go, there's been political will to get these projects up and going, whereas other parts of the basin plan have been largely ignored, or, you know, many people never believed that they would even happen. The 450 gigalitres, the constraints projects, there's never been any political will to actually enact the full basin plan. These projects act more like a dialysis for the floodplain rather than actually restoring ecological integrity. Many sites that are left out of these projects will just desiccate, will dry out, they'll fill up with trees, and when the big floods eventually come, just like the one we've seen, we'll see major fish deaths, we'll see major water quality problems. The projects do not connect our floodplains like the basin plan envisaged. They are interventionist. They are, we have many options, as put up by Jamie Pittock and Matt Coloff. We have many other options that don't require these huge amounts of intervention. They really risk us in 10 and 20 years' time running our river system like with an icon site mentality, which is very colonial in my view, and it does not put nature at the heart of what we value. It does not trust and give value to the true nature of our Australian ecosystems. It does not recognise how our systems really work. And it has the risk of simplifying our floodplain ecosystem. So with that, just pumping water in to certain sites, and it risks simplifying our ecosystems rather than having the diverse mixture and complex nature of all the different types of vegetation communities and animal communities that we do have. Okay, I think that's largely what I've rambled on bits and pieces of what I, oh, the other thing is consultation. My last point will be consultation. That's a big subject, but I'm pretty sure you've probably heard bits and pieces from various members of our community that I know have already presented to you. The consultation has been frustrating, to say the least, particularly because of COVID. It's been difficult, but I'll say that has not stopped a few of us in our communities trying to get the word out to make sure that our communities actually understand broadly what these policies, what water reform means, what the basin plan means, and specifically what these engineering projects are about, because I can tell you that the wider community does not understand, and there are only a very small number of people out there in the community who do understand what they're about, why they're happening. It was concerning when the project proponent moved from the Mallee CMA to Lower Murray Water. The projects were renamed and rebranded as the Victorian Floodplain Restoration Project, and the style of consultation moved towards a sort of a social media hats and stickers type consultation rather than the deep community, open community led consultation that I think is warranted for such big, important projects like this. So during COVID, we ran several community meetings, and then they've been ongoing since then, to the point where now I feel like in our community, we are just getting to the stage where people are beginning to understand what these projects are about, what the water reform on a broader scale means. And for example, we're working in our community to, you know, it feels like if we had some sort of forum where water reform and all of the things that go with it, whether it be whether it be the constraints relaxation projects, together with irrigation infrastructure, together with basin plan, all of these things, all of these parts of water reform are being thrown at communities to deal with and understand, and it's hugely complex. And it does warrant a deeper, it warrants more effort. It warrants sort of a community-led process rather than that sort of top-down process. And it certainly warrants something that's less politicised, less media-driven than what we've had. So it feels like we're just getting to that stage where this is the kind of forum that we could have in our communities. Unfortunately, it's just at the time when we're also being asked to just participate in these processes for these Victorian projects, because yeah, it just feels rushed, and it feels like it just feels unwise. It feels scary. It feels like they're being rushed through when our community is just getting to understand what water reform is all about and what are the keys, how it's impacting our river in our region, and why, what we can do to sort of improve the situation. And I think in our community, there are a huge majority of people who would love to see constraints relaxation be the priority, and that do see that water is more important than engineering projects. They'd like to see overbank flows rather than large regulators, for example. So I think that the consultation process has been undertaken, but unfortunately it hasn't been, it's been glossy, it's been Facebook, it's been, actually the Victorian Floodplain Restoration Project even sponsored a fishing competition in our region, and they gave out a lot of stickers and hats and things like that, which I just don't think that that's the type of thing that's useful for such huge, big projects like this that are going to have an ongoing impact in our community for many, 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 many years. So we can do a lot better there. And if we had the chance to pause, I think that we could go a long way to improving the outcomes for this policy, for the basin plan. We could work through on a ground, in a community-driven way, and find out what were the best outcomes. And, if in the end the engineering projects are the way to go, well, we will have got there on our own terms, not because it was driven by a particular political view. I'll leave it at that, because I said I think I was only going to take 15 minutes, and I've probably taken more.
No problems. Thank you very much. You've stuck within the half hour, so it's not an issue at all. We were running behind time. It's been much longer morning than we anticipated for a whole number of reasons. So we don't have any questions specifically for you, but I really thank you for coming along and taking the time to present to us. We appreciate hearing from you.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So that does bring us to the close of the day. I will just ask in a moment if there are any things we need to discuss before we rise, but I'll mention a couple of documents that have been tabled. So firstly, the email from the committee to the proponent with the extra questions that I mentioned this morning. So document 166 and Donald McLeod, who did not verbally present to the hearing, has circulated an email with just some content to supplement his original submission. And to note that our timetable at this stage, the committee, as I mentioned, will get that other email to the proponent as soon as we can. And at this stage, our next scheduled sitting day, which is scheduled to be the final day of the hearing, is Wednesday next week, subject to any change that we might decide in response to the matters that we discussed this morning with Mr. Townsend. So are there any other matters that we need to cover off, Mr. Townsend, from your perspective?
Only, and I'm sorry if I just missed it, but those questions that we've received, I know are the follow-up questions to the experts. Is there any indication when we might expect the questions regarding the closed session?
I can't give you an exact time, but as soon as we can get it to you, we will. We're certainly working on that.
No, that's fine. I just, I'll just again remind you, we will keep our eye out and respond.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Yes, and we'll look to respond to your response as quickly as we can as well. So thank you very much, everybody. So that finishes our third week of sitting with one final full day to go for the proponents closing next week. So I hope everybody enjoys the break over the next few days, and we'll see you at this stage 10 a.m. next Wednesday, unless we advise otherwise, or unless there's a change for other reasons, which actually won't be everybody. Mr. Townsend, as I'm saying that, I can see the look on your face. If there is any change to the timetable, we will advise parties promptly. Thank you very much. So I look forward to seeing you next week.